The story of the Picts begins in silence. No empire's anthem, no founding chronicle, just mist rolling off the North Sea and settling on a land that preferred to be left alone. Northern Scotland 2,000 years ago was not the green postcard we imagine. It was a hard, soaked wilderness of granite peat and wind that could peel paint off a ship. People here survived by nerve, not nostalgia. And yet amid this cold edge of the world, a culture took shape tough, intricate, and almost allergic to being understood. The Romans called them Picti, the painted ones. It wasn't a compliment. It was shorthand for those people we never managed to conquer. They met the legions with ambush fog and a kind of quiet arrogance born from knowing the land better than any map could. While Rome was paving Britain in stone, the Picts were memorizing the hills. Archaeology gives us flashes instead of speeches. Ring forts on high ground fields, bounded by stone walls, fragments of jewelry shaped by hands that worked without rulers or compasses. They farmed barley-herded cattle, carved symbols on rock faces, and somehow turned survival into art. Their world ran on cooperation more than hierarchy. Leadership was earned by reputation, not decree. If you want to picture their daily life, think less of barbarian camps and more of tight, interwoven communities. Families sharing smoke-filled roundhouses. Children learning by watching rather than listening. Storytellers holding memory in their voices. Every object was both useful and spiritual. A comb could also be a charm. A brooch might be a promise. To the Romans, this was chaos beyond the wall. To the Picts, it was order of another kind. Their landscape dictated rhythm, sow, harvest, defend, celebrate, and their gods were woven directly into weather and water. A storm wasn't divine anger. It was a reminder that the world still noticed you. We find their traces everywhere, but never their words. No Pictish chronicle, no alphabet that survived. Only the carvings, those looping symbols cut deep into stone, still standing in pastures and graveyards today. They're not decoration. They're sentences we can no longer read. Spirals, crescents, rods, beasts, each a line, in a poem that has outlived its language. Even now, walking through the damp air of Aberdeenshire or Angus, you sense that their world hasn't quite left. The mist still behaves like it remembers them. The hills look like they're keeping secrets. And when you touch one of those stones, slick with rain, it feels less like touching history and more like brushing against someone who simply stopped talking. The Picts never asked to be mysterious. History made them that way. But beneath the silence, you can almost hear the hum of a civilization that knew balance before kingdoms and permanence before fame. They were the North before the word North meant anything. Before the legions ever glimpsed the northern horizon, the people of Scotland already lived in a rhythm that needed no empire to dictate it. Theirs was a world of stone, wood, and weather and Iron Age civilization, quietly perfecting the art of survival. No marble, no written archives, no grand proclamations, just endurance and an uncanny grace for making beauty out of hardship. Imagine a morning in the 3rd century BCE. The fog hasn't yet lifted from the glen, and a ring of roundhouses crouches against the hillside like sleeping animals. Each is built of dry stone walls 3 feet thick, roofed in thatch smoke curling through the central hole. Inside, the fire never truly dies. It's banked at night and coaxed back to life each dawn, the glowing heart of the family. There's the scent of peat smoke and barley porridge, the rhythmic hiss of the bellows from a nearby smithy. These were not simple folk, huddling against the cold, but masters of their environment. Their hillforts were feats of engineering, timber-laced walls, terraces for crops' drainage systems cunningly carved into rock. At places like Taponath or Mither, tap vast fortified citadels, crowned mountaintops, commanding every valley below. They were both fortress and statement, We belong to this land, and the land belongs to us. Archaeologists uncover the remains of rotary querns, primitive yet efficient grain mills, alongside iron plowshares and sickles. It's easy to imagine the soundscape, the creak of harnessed leather, the whistle of wind across open moors, and the lowing of cattle being herded to higher ground for summer grazing. Cattle were wealth, not just food. A man's fortune could be measured in horns and hides, and disputes over grazing rights were probably settled with the same seriousness that later ages reserved for treaties. And yet these highland farmers were not isolated. Far from it. Bronze mirrors, glass beads, and fragments of Mediterranean amphorae appear in their settlements, trophies of trade that connected them to a network spanning Gaul Iberia, even the distant Roman world, long before the empire's borders reached them. To imagine these people as cut off from civilization is to misunderstand the meaning of civilization itself. They were civilization, just not the marble and chariot kind. At Rhynie in Aberdeenshire, once just a quiet field of sheep and rain excavations, revealed something astonishing evidence of imported wine-fine glassware and bronze ornaments of continental design. This wasn't some barbarian outpost. It was a royal site, a power center humming with activity. Craftsmen shaped brooches with intricate spirals and animal forms, wolves, birds, serpents, motifs that would later define the unmistakable Pictish aesthetic. Their metalwork was so refined that even Roman artisans might have raised an impressed eyebrow. But it wasn't just metal that told their story. The very layout of their settlements spoke of organization fields, aligned boundaries, marked paths, worn smooth by generations of feet. They lived in small clusters of kin, but across the land there was an underlying coherence, a social grammar invisible to outsiders, yet binding them together through custom and ceremony. It's here that we can glimpse the roots of what would later become the Pictish system of shared landholding. The word pit, meaning a portion or share of land, still lingers in hundreds of Scottish place names: Pitlochry, Pittenweem, Pitmedden. Each pit was a reminder that land wasn't just property. It was a communal inheritance managed through ancient agreements and obligations. In this way, even before they had kings or written laws, these northern tribes had invented the backbone of governance shared rules for survival. Their religion, too, was deeply woven into this pattern. To call it pagan is like calling a sunrise unchristian, technically true, but entirely missing the point. They lived in a world steeped in animism. Rivers had spirits. Trees held voices. A carved stone wasn't just an idol. It was a listening post between the mortal and the divine. Rituals likely centered around fertility harvest and the great cyclical theater of light and dark. The people understood the solstices as lifelines. They built cairns and stone circles aligned with the stars so that time itself became architecture. If you were to travel back and stand among them, you'd notice something else: the artistry everywhere. They engraved patterns onto weapons jewelry, even domestic tools. It's as if beauty was not optional. It was a moral duty. The spirals that decorated their brooches weren't just decorative. They were cosmological, echoing the eternal flow of life and death, light and shadow. These designs weren't copied from Rome or Greece. They grew from the soil of the north itself, as natural as the swirl of wind on water. And of course, they fought. You can't survive in a land of scarce resources without knowing how to defend them. Raiding was both necessity and sport diplomacy by other means. Warriors carried long iron swords, oval shields, and sometimes painted their bodies for battle, not just for intimidation, but as ritual armor. The pigment mixed with animal fat and woad gleamed blue in torchlight, turning flesh into symbol. Centuries later, Roman writers would see this and scribble Picti, the painted ones. They likely meant it as an insult. The name endured anyway, but to the people themselves, those markings may have meant something closer to identity or protection. Every tattoo, every swirl of pigment may have told a story of lineage, victory, devotion. In an age before flags, the body was the banner. We don't have their words, but we have their silence, and it speaks volumes. Every hill fort ruin, every ring of stones, every bit of bronze filigree is a fragment of a sentence we're still trying to finish. What we know is that when the Romans finally pushed into Caledonia in the 1st century CE, they did not find savages waiting in mud huts. They found a landscape already claimed by people who understood it in ways no outsider ever could. The tribes they encountered, Caledoni, Maiatai, Vinicones, Taixali, were part of a cultural ecosystem stretching back 1,000 years. They traded, feasted, intermarried, and occasionally murdered each other over cattle or insult. But beneath that chaos was continuity. These were the ancestors of the Picts, long before the word existed, already shaping the world that Rome would try and fail to tame. And when the first Roman scouts glimpsed smoke rising from distant hill forts, they likely saw what we now glimpse in museum glass cases and windswept ruins, a civilization both fierce and intricate, unrecorded but unforgettable. Because history doesn't always begin when someone writes it down. Sometimes it begins in the hum of a forge, the rhythm of a quernstone, and the soft blue glow of paint on skin. The Picts' story was already centuries old when Rome arrived to discover them. The empire would march north, expecting conquest, and instead it would meet endurance. And endurance always wins in the long run. By the time Rome finally turned its imperial gaze toward northern Britain, the people of the Mist were already ready for them, though they didn't know it yet. In 79 CE, when Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola landed his legions on Scottish shores, he likely believed it was just another provincial campaign. After all, he had subjugated Wales and southern England. What could possibly resist Rome's machine of conquest? But the mountains of Caledonia had never read Roman manuals. And the people who lived among those peaks, the ancestors of the Picts, were not a problem to be solved, but a landscape of resistance incarnate. Picture it: a Roman legion in full order, tight formations of iron and discipline marching north through endless drizzle. Shields, polished sandals sinking into mud standards, glittering in a sun that never quite appears. And somewhere in the fog ahead, silence. The kind of silence that feels alive. Then a sudden whistle, a scream, and the woods erupt, javelins raining from the tree-line, war cries slicing through the air. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere, then just as quickly gone. Welcome to Caledonia. Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law and biographer, wrote of these northern tribes with that curious mix of admiration and horror that Romans often reserved for people they couldn't understand. He described them as tall, fierce painted blue, living without fear of death. To Roman readers, this was exotic savagery. To us, it sounds like people who had learned that survival depended on knowing every rock, every stream, every fog bank, and on appearing striking and vanishing faster than a bureaucrat could file a report. The Romans called them Caledoni and Maiatai, then not yet Picts. But already the traits that would define the Pictish character were their independence, ingenuity, and a remarkable ability to adapt without surrender. Archaeology reveals that Roman goods, glass pottery coins, found their way deep into the north, but always transformed, reshaped to local taste. They didn't imitate Rome. They absorbed it like a mineral into the bloodstream and made it their own. Agricola's campaign northward was as ambitious as it was doomed. He built forts, roads, and supply lines moving with the precision of a clockmaker. Yet the terrain itself rebelled against him. The legions trudged through heather and bog, harried by invisible enemies who struck supply lines and messengers who understood that time, terrain, and hunger were weapons sharper than any sword. To a Roman commander, used to orderly battlefields, Caledonia must have felt like trying to conquer smoke. The Roman historian himself, Tacitus, tried to make sense of the failure in words that still echo through history. He quotes a speech by the tribal leader Calgacus, the swordsman, before the legendary battle of Mons Graupius. To robbery, slaughter, and plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a desert and call it peace. Whether Calgacus ever uttered those words, we'll never know. But in the mouth of that imaginary chieftain, Tacitus gave voice to something larger, the empire's uneasy awareness that its conquests might not be moral victories. In a sense, the Picts won that argument before they ever won a war. When the battle came somewhere in the mists of the Grampian Hills, around 84 CE, the Romans claimed victory, as they always did. Tacitus reports that 10,000 Caledonians fell to fewer than 400 Romans' numbers, as believable as a fisherman's brag. Yet despite this supposed triumph, the legions withdrew soon after. No garrisons held the highlands. No colonies were founded. The map was colored red for a season, then washed clean by rain. The painted people had outlasted the empire's patience. But not before Rome left its fingerprints. The contact brought trade, new technologies, and perhaps most importantly, a unifying sense of us against them. Nothing binds rival tribes together like a common invader. It was during these centuries of uneasy coexistence raids and truces markets and massacres that the scattered clans of northern Britain began to see themselves as a single cultural horizon. Out of this crucible of resistance, the identity that we later call Pictish was forged. Roman forts rose and fell, like temporary blisters on the land, Inchtuthal, Ardach, Cawdor, each abandoned sooner than the engineers expected. The empire learned the hard way that Caledonia could not be taxed or tamed. Even their greatest barrier, Hadrian's Wall, finished in 128 CE, was less a mark of triumph than of resignation. It wasn't built to protect Rome's dominance. It was built to admit defeat politely in stone. South of that wall, Roman Britain became a patchwork of villas and Latin inscriptions. North of it, the Picts watched, traded, raided, and endured. They had no emperor, no senate, no slave plantations, just lineage law and landscape. Yet when the empire finally cracked centuries later, it was the painted ones who still stood on their own soil, their traditions intact. The Romans left Britain. The Picts had never left at all. And what did Rome make of them? Fear and fascination in equal measure. Cassius Dio wrote that they lived in tents, went naked and barefoot, and practiced a form of communal marriage, which says far more about Roman imagination than Pictish reality. To men accustomed to marble baths and tunics, anyone in wool and weather-beaten leather must have seemed half mythical. The Romans called them wild because they could not categorize them, and to an empire built on bureaucracy, that was the ultimate offense. Yet beneath those condescending reports, there's a grudging respect. Roman officers stationed along the frontier sent letters home, describing the beauty of the northern mountains, the intelligence of the locals, and the curious symbols carved on stones near their camps. A century later, traders were still crossing Hadrian's Wall with wagons full of northern goods, furs, amber metalwork, while Roman coins found their way into Pictish jewelry, hammered flat and reused as pendants. The exchange never really stopped. It just became less imperial and more human. By the late 2nd century, the Romans realized that northern Britain was not a land to rule, but a storm to weather. Their forts became trading posts. Their patrols became merchants. Their spies became storytellers. And somewhere amid that long, uneasy coexistence, both sides changed. The Picts absorbed the empire's craft and weaponry, and Rome, in turn, absorbed a touch of Pictish fatalism, the quiet understanding that nothing, not even empire, lasts forever. When you walk today among the ruins of those Roman walls, you can still feel it, the tension between order and wilderness. On one side, the straight lines of Roman ambition. On the other, the rolling, indifferent moors that once swallowed legions whole. It's a perfect metaphor for the meeting of these two worlds, precision facing mystery marble confronting mist. Rome marched north, expecting conquest. Instead, it found reflection, its own fragility, mirrored in the blue-painted eyes of people who had no word for empire and no interest in joining one. They fought Rome not to destroy it, but to outlast it, and that, as history would prove, they did. Because long after the last Roman eagle was hauled south, the fires still burned in the hillforts. The querns still turned. The tattooed warriors still sang to the stones and sailed their small, sturdy boats across gray northern seas. They were called many things, Caledonians, Britons, Picts, but they all shared one truth. They belonged to the land more deeply than any conqueror could. The Romans would leave maps and ruins. The Picts would leave mystery, and mystery, it seems, survives longer. The Roman world ran on calendars and confidence. Their generals liked their wars need a beginning, a climax, a triumphal parade. But Caledonia didn't play by Roman choreography. It was a land that refused straight lines of roads, of logic, of obedience. And in the late summer of 84 CE, that refusal erupted into legend on a nameless, windswept hillside somewhere in the Grampians. Tacitus called it Mons Graupius. Scholars still argue where that mountain truly stood, but we know this much: beneath its gray slopes, two visions of the world collided. On one side, Rome, armored in disciplined banners, snapping in the wet wind. On the other, the painted tribes of the north, bare-armed, tattooed faces streaked with blue, singing battle songs older than Latin itself. Agricola had spent 6 years preparing for this moment. He'd built marching camps across southern Scotland, like breadcrumbs in the heather, each one a miniature Rome, straight roads, right angles, firelight glinting off armor. To the empire, the battle was destiny. To the Picts' ancestors, it was Tuesday. Before the fighting, the Roman chronicler tells us that a man named Calgacus addressed his warriors. Whether he existed or not hardly matters. What Tacitus put in his mouth still chills the air. They make a desert and call it peace. It's the kind of line that transcends propaganda, a moment when history blushes and truth slips through the cracks. In that imagined speech, you can hear every colonized people in miniature. Calgacus reminds his listeners that beyond the mountains, there is nowhere left to retreat. On this day, he says we shall prove what freedom means to those who have lost everything else. At dawn, the mists broke like curtains. Across the slopes, the Caledonian army gathered tens of thousands. Tacitus claims, though Roman writers never met a zero, they didn't multiply. They came not as one nation, but as many clans bound by urgency. The Taiaxali from the east, the Caledoni from the forests, the Maiatai from the lowlands. Their hair was lime-washed, their shields painted with spirals and beasts. They fought with long iron swords, their chariots clattering across the flat ground below. The Romans formed up in their well-rehearsed geometry auxiliaries, in front legions, in reserve cavalry poised like punctuation marks on either wing. The wind howled off the mountains, carrying the smell of peat and iron. The first arrows hissed through fog. Battle began. Imagine the noise: 1,000 bronze horns, the drum of feet on wet turf, the clash of sword on shield. Roman discipline met Highland ferocity, order meeting chaos. The chariots swept in circles, flinging javelins before wheeling away. From above, the Caledonian slingers rained stones down the slopes. For a brief hour, the empire trembled, but Rome's machine was built for attrition. Its soldiers fought in layers, each man protected by the next, every wound absorbed by the formation. Slowly, mechanically, they advanced uphill. Calgacus's warriors charged again and again, fierce but uncoordinated, breaking on the Roman wall of shields, like surf on a cliff. When the Roman cavalry swung around and struck their flanks, the momentum broke. The hillside turned slick with rain and blood. Tacitus claimed 10,000 northern warriors died that day. More likely, it was hundreds. Yet even if the numbers are exaggeration, the cost was real. The Caledonians melted back into the hills, carrying their wounded and their legends. The Romans held the field, declared victory, and wrote about it in perfect Latin. But the strangest thing happened next. Agricola didn't stay. Within months, he was recalled to Rome. His forts north of the Tay were abandoned. The victors marched home, leaving nothing behind but ashes and a name no one could later find on a map. And so, Mons Graupius became a paradox, a triumph that ended an invasion. The empire had won everything except the right to remain. For the tribes of the north, the memory of that battle became something different, a story whispered around fires, proof that Rome could bleed. Calgacus, real or not, became a symbol, the ghost of defiance that would echo through every century of Scottish history. His speech, though penned by a Roman, may have captured something the Picts themselves believed, that empire was a temporary storm and the mountains were eternal. Archaeologists have searched for traces of the battle for generations. At Benachi Magray Hill and Tapo Nath, they've found Roman marching camp spearheads and charred earth, but never certainty. Perhaps that's fitting. The Picts' world thrives on half-light. Even their victories and defeats dissolve into mist the moment we try to pin them down. Yet the aftermath of Mons Graupius changed everything. The Romans learned respect, if not humility. They retreated south to the valleys, fortifying what they could hold. They built walls, first temporary ramparts, then stone fortresses, then Hadrian's Great Barrier, stretching from sea to sea. You can almost hear the sigh in that architecture, this far and no farther. Meanwhile, the northern tribes grew stronger in their isolation. Deprived of Rome's presence, they evolved on their own terms. The battle that was meant to crush them had ironically given them identity. A common enemy had forged unity, and in the silence after the legions withdrew, that unity began to ferment into culture, into art, language, and legend. In the centuries to come, Pictish carvers would etch scenes of chariot and sword onto standing stones. Maybe one of those intricate panels now weather-worn in some farmer's field is their memory of Mons Graupius, a swirl of horses, a double disc, a crescent pierced by a rod. The symbols are indecipherable to us, but perhaps to them it meant we endured. The Romans, of course, filed reports and moved on. Tacitus would use the campaign to glorify his father-in-law's career. The empire turned its attention back to Gaul, to Germany, to other frontiers, where obedience seemed more economical. But somewhere north of their abandoned forts, the painted tribes watched and waited. They had learned Rome's rhythms, the predictability of empire, its addiction to order. And they understood the land was still theirs. Standing on that windswept hillside today, you can still feel the contradiction. The soil remembers iron, yet the grass grows thick and quiet. The victory that Rome claimed exists only in books. The people they tried to erase left their mark on stone. And in that reversal lies the essence of the Pict story. They were never truly conquered, because conquest requires acknowledgement. Rome came to write them into history, and instead wrote itself out of theirs. So when the night fog rolls down over the Grampians and the wind moans through the heather, it's easy to imagine the ghosts of both sides drifting across the moor. Roman centurions in perfect formation, Caledonian warriors painted for glory, each fading into mist. Two worlds that met for one day clashed and vanished, leaving behind a silence that still hums with unfinished sentences. The Battle of Mons Graupius was the empire's northernmost heartbeat, and the moment the painted people realized that their greatest weapon was time itself. They didn't need to win every fight. They only had to remain. And in the long story of Scotland, that was victory enough. After Mons Graupius, Rome learned an old northern truth: there are lands you can march across and lands that march back at you. The Caledonian hills were the latter wet patient and impossible to own. So the empire did what empires eventually do when the world refuses to kneel at built walls. The first stones rose beneath gray skies in 122 CE. Emperor Hadrian, part soldier, part architect of paranoia, ordered a barrier to separate the Romans from the barbarians. It sounds poetic until you remember that every line on a map begins with fear. His engineers measured 80 miles from coast to coast, cutting Britain in half, like a wound that never fully healed. Hadrian's Wall wasn't a fence to keep people out. It was a machine. Picture it, towers every third of a mile, turrets, where sentries warmed their hands above small fires, signal beacons flashing across the hills like silent Morse code. Behind the rampart ran a service road, the military way, where dispatch riders galloped between fortresses with orders and gossip. And south of the stone barrier stretched the vallum, a great trench, with ramparts on either side, not to stop invaders, but to control traffic. Every crossing point was a customs gate. The wall wasn't just defense, it was immigration policy. To the north, the Picts, though that word had not yet solidified, watched the wall rise, likely amused. Imagine them from the far ridge, warriors in wool cloaks, traders leading ponies, heavy with furs, and amber children perched on boulders, watching this colossal scar creep across their horizon. The Romans were erecting a monument to their own anxiety. Still, the wall changed everything. It created two worlds, the polished order of Roman Britain in the south, and the wild, independent tapestry of tribes beyond. Yet trade continued. Merchants passed through the gates with carts of grain hides and glass beads. Northern cattle grazed near Roman sentries. Latin curses mingled with Celtic laughter. There were even mixed marriages, frontier love stories now lost to time. For all its pretensions of separation, Hadrian's Wall became a border that connected as much as it divided. But walls never stay still. 20 years later, another emperor, Antoninus Pius, decided that Hadrian's boundary was too pessimistic. He wanted glory, not pragmatism, and ordered a second barrier built further north, between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. It was shorter, yes, but bolder, an audacious attempt to slice Scotland a second time. Constructed mostly of turf and timber, the Antonine Wall was less impressive in stone, but more impressive in intent Rome's last great gamble on Caledonia. The Antonine Wall's garrisons housed nearly 7,000 troops packed into 19 forts. The soldiers were not Italian aristocrats. They were Spaniards, Syrians, Germans, Thracians, Rome's patchwork army of everyone except Romans. On quiet nights, they looked out across the moor, hearing the wind howl like a voice that didn't care who built the walls of empire. For 20 years, the new frontier held. But the cost of defending it bled the treasury, and the Picts, never impressed by foreign architecture, simply walked around it. They struck supply caravans, ambushed patrols, and then melted back into forests that swallowed legions whole. The empire sighed, packed up, and retreated once again to Hadrian's old line. The Antonine experiment became a ruin before it had time to grow moss. Yet these stone and turf veins across the land did more than mark Roman frustration. They redefined the world the Picts would inherit. Borders breed identity. For every Latin inscription declaring victory, a new northern legend was born in reply. The people beyond the wall began to see themselves not as scattered clans, but as custodians of a shared freedom, the keepers of the untamed side of Britain. And so while the Romans fortified their boundary, the tribes beyond fortified their story. They were no longer just Caledoni or Maiatai. They were the painted ones, the Picti. The label started as mockery and became a badge of honor, an identity born out of the empire's attempt to define them as other. There's irony in that Hadrian's Wall didn't just divide a province, it gave birth to a people. Archaeologists at Vindolanda, one of the wall's best preserved forts, have unearthed letters that reveal the human texture of this frontier. Requests for socks, complaints about beer shortages, invitations to birthday parties from one officer's wife to another. Between such lines, you can feel the thin thread of ordinary life stretched over extraordinary tension. Soldiers begged their families to send warmer clothing. The Britons are naked and savage, one complains. You can sense the homesickness under the arrogance. Rome had reached the edge of its world, and the edge was cold. To the north, things looked different. In the hills above, smoke curled from Pictish hearths, untroubled by imperial paperwork. Their villages thrived precisely because they didn't have to feed Rome's appetite. They fished the cold seas, raised hardy cattle, and traded on their own terms. And in the evenings, they told stories about the men behind the wall, southern ghosts who lived in stone cages. Perhaps in their fireside tales they pitied them. Every empire builds its monuments to control, but the northern wind always has the final edit. When the Romans finally abandoned Britain in the early 5th century, the wall didn't fall. It simply became a line of convenient quarries. Farmers pried out its stones to build cottages. Shepherds grazed their flocks where once centurions stood on watch. In time, the wall became landscape again, swallowed by the same green patience it once sought to contain. But the Picts remembered. To them, the wall was a story carved in the land itself, a cautionary tale of arrogance made visible. It reminded them that great powers can crumble, but stone endures. They didn't need walls. Their defense was the terrain, the weather, and their will. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Hadrian's Wall, not the physical ruin, but the psychological frontier it drew between two ways of being. To the South Empire order hierarchy. To the North, adaptability, freedom, defiance. Each depended on the other to define itself. Without barbarians, Rome had no excuse for virtue. Without Rome, the Picts had no mirror in which to see how different they were. Even now, when you walk along the wall at dusk, you can hear that tension hum in the wind. One side neat, and tamed, the other wild and open. The sheep graze indifferently across the boundary, as if mocking the memory of the legionaries who once froze in their armor trying to hold it. The Romans thought the wall would stand for eternity. The Picts knew better. Eternity to them was the fog creeping over the hills, erasing all lines. By the time the legions withdrew south for the last time, sometime in the early 5th century, the walls they had raised were already dissolving into moss. But north of them, beyond the Romans' brittle line of stone, something was stirring. From a patchwork of hillforts, kin groups, and chieftaincies, a new identity began to bloom, slowly like lichen gripping granite. Out of the fog, the Picts emerged not overnight, but through centuries of quiet evolution. Ethnogenesis historians call it the birth of a people. But the Picts would have simply called it life continuing as it always had, until someone from outside gave them a name. The empire had left a vacuum, and in that silence, tribes who had once feuded over cattle began to find common cause in something grander, shared rituals, shared enemies, shared memory. The soil still remembers that transition. Across the lands from Fife to Caithness, archaeologists find traces of a cultural coalescence, shared motifs, repeated patterns, echoes of an idea that was taking shape long before anyone wrote it down. The Picts did not invade, they became. Their emergence wasn't an explosion, it was a slow dawn, one that revealed how deep their roots already ran. In the aftermath of Rome's retreat, Britain fractured. To the south, the former Roman towns stumbled into ruined villas, crumbled baths went cold. But the northern tribes, those whom Rome had never tamed, thrived. They had no roads to maintain, no taxes, to miss no imperial supply chains to collapse. They knew how to live without Rome's systems, because they had never depended on them. And that ironically made them stronger when the empire vanished. The old hillforts came back to life. Places like Burghead Dunatar and Craig Fadraig swelled into royal centers. Timber ramparts were rebuilt halls, and large granaries expanded. People gathered around new rulers, chieftains who were no longer just war leaders, but organizers of trade judges and patrons of artisans. Their power wasn't absolute. It was negotiated through kinship and reputation. But through them, the framework of Pictish kingship began to form. Their unity wasn't political at first, it was cultural. A shared artistic vocabulary spread like wildfire spirals, Z-rods, crescents, double discs. You could travel hundreds of miles and recognize the same motifs carved into stone, painted on shields, stamped onto bronze. A visual language long before writing. A language that said, we belong to the same story. We see it, too, in their names. Place names beginning with pit, from the old Pictish word for portion or share, appear everywhere. Pitlochry, Pittenweem, Pitmedden. Each one a linguistic fossil, marking out the social order of landholding that underpinned their civilization. This was no random scattering of clans. It was an administrative system, primitive perhaps, but methodical, based on communal ownership and clearly defined boundaries. The Picts were already organizing their world with an almost bureaucratic precision, centuries before Scottish charters put it into Latin. Their language itself, now lost, was likely related to the Brythonic Celtic branch, the same linguistic family as Welsh and Cornish, rather than Gaelic. Which means that before Scotland spoke Gaelic, before it sang in Scots, before English ever arrived, its first organized tongue was Pictish, a shimmering, half-forgotten sibling to the speech of ancient Wales. It is strange to imagine that the ancestors of today's Scots once shared words with distant cousins across the sea in Brittany. Yet rivers and place names still carry that ghost vocabulary, Tadi Don, echoes of an older syntax carved into the landscape. But identity, like stone, needs pressure to take shape. The Picts' sense of themselves hardened not in peace, but in the friction of survival. To the south, Romano-British warlords squabbled in the ruins of their villas. To the west, Irish raiders began landing on the Scottish Isles, establishing footholds that would later grow into the kingdom of Dal Riata. And across the sea, Norse winds were already stirring. The north would never be short of visitors. In this churning borderland, the Picts adapted. Their art absorbed Roman influence, but reimagined it. Imported glass and bronze became components in designs utterly unlike anything found in Italy. Their metalwork adopted techniques from Gaul and Ireland, but the iconography wolves, eagles intertwined. Serpents remained distinctly northern. They were magpies of genius, stealing everything, copying nothing. The economy of their world was complex and remarkably resilient. Agriculture flourished in fertile regions like Fife and Angus barley oats, and wheat grown in rotation to feed growing populations. In the uplands, herders drove hardy cattle and sheep through seasonal pastures. Trade flowed along rivers and coasts. Salmon hides and amber went south. Pottery, wine, and fine metals came north. The Picts had inherited Rome's infrastructure in fragments and repurposed it to serve their own networks. Where Rome had seen wilderness, the Picts saw opportunity. But something subtler than economics was binding them together. Their art and architecture began to radiate shared symbolism, not just decoration, but communication. The earliest symbol stones appearing in the 4th and 5th centuries were not random ornaments. They were statements, land claims, lineage markers, declarations of divine right etched for eternity. In these carvings, historians see the earliest whispers of a Pictish state. Religion, too, was changing. Pagan gods still ruled the hills, the thunder god, the river mother, the horse spirits. But a new current was arriving from the West Christianity. Not yet dominant, not yet pure, but blending and twisting into something uniquely northern. On one stone, a serpent coils around a cross. On another, a crescent floats beside a fish. The new faith did not erase the old it braided with it. The Pictish mind saw no contradiction between saints and spirits. Both guarded the harvest, both demanded respect. All the while their legends deepened. Oral traditions, half myth, half genealogy, began to solidify around certain names. Drust, Necton, Telorgan figures, who straddled the line between hero and ancestor. The Pictish kings, lists that later monks would copy, were less history than mythography, an attempt to tether a sprawling confederation to a single lineage. Yet beneath the embellishment lies a truth that the Picts had moved beyond tribal leadership into monarchy. The idea of a shared dynasty, however unstable, was their greatest innovation. Genetic studies of their burial sites today reveal something almost poetic continuity. The DNA of early Picts is nearly identical to that of their Iron Age predecessors. No great invasion, no mysterious lost race from Scandinavia or Gaul, just local people evolving into something new, culturally richer, but biologically familiar. The Picts were Scotland's own children, learning to name themselves. And so, the centuries after Rome's departure, what the textbooks call the Dark Ages, were anything but dark in the north. They were an age of quiet construction, of societies weaving themselves together from the threads empire left behind. In the mist, the Picts carved a future no historian would understand for over 1,000 years. When we speak of their birth, we should imagine less a trumpet blast and more a slow sunrise. A light creeping over lochs and forests, revealing forts where smoke still rose, farmers tending to fields under watchful hills, artisans hammering silver in longhouses where stories echoed in an unrecorded tongue. In those centuries, the Picts didn't need Rome or Britain or anyone to define them. They were busy defining themselves. They became the North's first true civilization, a people with their own language, their own laws, their own art, and the quiet audacity to thrive without empire. And as the old Roman roads fell silent and ivy crept over forgotten altars, the painted ones stepped out of the shadow of history and into their own. They were no longer the tribes beyond the wall. They were Pictavia, the land of the painted people. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, had just gained another nation. If you were to stand in a Pictish village in the 5th century, before monks, before manuscripts, you might first notice the colors, not of banners or flags, but of skin. Blue, black, green, spiraling like smoke over arms and faces, shoulders, and thighs. The Romans had seen them in battle and scoffed, calling them Picti, the painted ones. But to the Picts themselves, the pigments were more than decoration. They were identity made visible. The dyes came from woad, a stubborn little plant whose leaves, when crushed and fermented, yielded that unmistakable shade of ghostly blue. Mixed with animal fat or ash, it clung to skin, even through rain and blood. The process stank literally, but to the Picts, it was sacred chemistry. The pigment wasn't applied with vanity, it was applied with ceremony. Each swirl and knot was a sentence, a declaration of belonging. It told the story of your clan, your spirit, your place among the living and the dead. To an outsider, the patterns might seem abstract. To a Pict, they were language. A spiral for eternity, a serpent for wisdom, a double disc for alliance, a V-rod for protection. The same symbols that would later appear on carved stones once danced on living flesh. The people wore their history. When they went to war, they did not need banners. Their skin was already the battlefield. But these painted ones were not just warriors. They were engineers, metal workers, and artists whose tools hummed with the rhythm of creation. At Berghead, Reaney, and Craig Fadrig, archaeologists have unearthed evidence of a society humming with craft and purpose. Iron furnaces roared beside halls where kings feasted. Bronze was melted and shaped into brooches that gleamed like captured firelight. Silver was twisted into chains as thick as a wrist, worn not just as ornament, but as proof of royal favor. In the dim light of a forge, sparks flew as a craftsman hammered a blade that could outlast him. Each strike was half art, half prayer. The Picts didn't separate beauty from utility. A plowshare might carry the same careful engraving as a sword pommel. To make something durable was to give it a soul, and so their objects' mirrors, pins' torques, were as alive as their myths. A comb carved from whalebone might bear a knotwork pattern identical to the one painted on a warrior's chest. Continuity was everything. This artistry wasn't luxury, it was hierarchy in metal. To wear a finely wrought penannular brooch or a chain of silver was to declare your rank without words. The same way Romans used togas and senators used seals, the Picts used ornamentation. Even in death, they made statements. Graves of nobles have yielded jewelry and weaponry designed, not just for this life, but the next, because in their cosmology, the spirit's journey continued. And that cosmology was vast. Their gods were woven into the world around them. They didn't live on distant mountains or in tidy temples. They lived in the soil, in rivers, in the thunder that rolled down the glen. The Pictish pantheon was a weather system unpredictable, immense, and intimate all at once. A storm wasn't punishment. It was conversation. The sun was not worshipped as a disk, but as a rhythm its light carving seasons into their bones. Some of these deities would later merge into Celtic legends, Bride the goddess of spring and poetry, Tyrannus the thunder god, Epona the horse spirit. But in Pictish hands, they were local and personal. A sacred grove in Angus might honor the same goddess by a different name as one in Caithness. There was no centralized religion, only networks of reverence. Rituals varied, but fire was constant. Offerings burned at crossroads and riverbanks. The smoke rose toward ancestors who were never far away. They believed the dead walked alongside the living invisible but attentive. Burial sites show careful positioning of bodies, often accompanied by everyday items, tools, bowls, weapons, as if the afterlife was simply an extension of daily life. To live well was to prepare well for the journey ahead. It was a religion of continuity, of cycles of eternal return. And if we could listen in on their daily lives beyond the ritual, we'd hear a very human soundtrack, the thump of grain being crowned on quernstones, the low hum of gossip in smoke-filled roundhouses, the bark of dogs guarding herds, and the laughter of children chasing each other around the hearth. They ate porridge thickened with honey, stewed meats, with herbs gathered from the hills, drank ale brewed from barley, and used stone cups, polished smooth by years of feasts. Their homes were modest, but solid timber posts, wattle walls roofs of straw and heather, comfort enough to endure the long northern winters. To the Romans, this was barbarism. To the Picts, it was abundance, because in the rhythm of their seasons lay a wisdom. Rome never learned everything survived by balance, not dominance. When crops failed, the herders shared their cattle. When raiders struck one valley, neighboring tribes sheltered the refugees. What looked like chaos from afar was cooperation in disguise. Yet they were no strangers to conflict. Raids and feuds were seasonal rituals as much as survival tactics. A successful raid wasn't merely theft, it was proof of vitality, courage, and luck. The taking of cattle or bronze from rivals reaffirmed status. To give it back later in gift exchange ceremonies reaffirmed peace. Even war had etiquette. A warrior's worth lay not just in killing, but in boasting correctly about it afterward. And in those boasts, the oral epics recited around fires, you can hear the heartbeat of their culture. The storyteller, or seanchade, was not just entertainment, but memory incarnate. He, or sometimes she, was the archive of the tribe, the keeper of genealogies, the custodian of laws disguised as legends. To forget a story was worse than to lose a battle. Words were weapons too, but subtler ones. Over time, this combination of art, religion, and kinship built a civilization far more structured than its neighbors ever imagined. The Picts were not a mystery to themselves. They were a society with layers: farmers, artisans, nobles, priests. Their power centers, places like Scone and Fortiviot, were already acting as proto-capitals. Assemblies met on sacred hills, where laws were recited aloud so that justice, like their body paint, could be seen and remembered. They left no literature, but they left something better: the physical poetry of craftsmanship. Every carved stone, every torch, every etched mirror is a syllable of a language we're still learning to read. Together, these fragments tell a story not of savagery, but of sophistication, of a people who saw no division between art and life, between the spiritual and the practical, between body and land. They were the painted people because they understood that the body was the first canvas, the earth the second, and memory the third. Their designs weren't fashion, they were philosophy in motion geometry of the soul. When the Romans finally left Britain entirely in the 5th century, their walls crumbling behind them, the Picts did not celebrate. They simply carried on. Empires come and go. Pigments fade and are repainted. What lasts is the rhythm of the hammer, the whisper of the brush, and the unbroken chain of stories that keep a people alive. And as the last Roman patrol disappeared into the southern mist, the painted ones, iron-hearted, blue-skinned, and utterly themselves watched from their hills, unvanquished and unbothered. They had outlasted an empire, not by conquest, but by culture. Their skin bore the proof. History often changes, not in slow decades, but in nights of smoke and thunder. One of those nights came in the winter of 367 CE, when the Picti stopped being a rumor, whispered along Hadrian's wall, and became a calamity written in panic. By then, Rome's grasp on Britain was already slipping. The southern villas were still polishing mosaics and pouring wine, but the garrisons that protected them were thinning out. Legions had been recalled to Gaul generals, replaced by bureaucrats, and the great frontier that once hummed with discipline had begun to rust. The empire still thought of the wall as a barrier. The Picts thought of it as an invitation. It began quietly, as these things do: a few raids in early spring, cattle taken a patrol, ambushed a watchtower burned. But then something changed. The attacks came not from one tribe, but from many, all at once, as if someone somewhere had drawn a line on the map and whispered, "Now." Roman historians would later call it the Great Conspiracy, a coordinated uprising that shattered the illusion of security across Britain. To the north, the Picts surged southward across the frontier, their warriors painted and howling. From the west came the Scots of Hibernia, the Irish Sea dark with their curraghs. From the east, Saxon longships slipped through fog to raid the coasts. And somewhere among them, a mysterious people called the Atticati joined the chaos, perhaps allies of the Picts, perhaps mercenaries, perhaps something in between. To the Romans in their crumbling villas, it must have felt as though the world itself had turned upside down. Farms were burned, towns abandoned, and garrisons cut off. The letters found at Vindolanda, once full of domestic complaints about socks and birthdays, vanished from the record after that winter, as though the pens themselves were silenced. But to the Picts, this was not madness. It was strategy. Centuries of skirmishes had taught them how to outthink the empire's lumbering order. They understood the weakness of a system stretched too thin, where soldiers defended walls but not people. They struck in waves, bypassing fortifications, cutting supply routes, and melting back into the hills before counterattacks could form. It wasn't barbarism. It was logistics with better instincts. Imagine a Roman officer at night standing on the wall's rampart as a horn sounds from the dark. Below him, the moors are flickering with distant fires, too many to count, moving too fast to chase. The wind carries the sound of drums and shouting, and somewhere the scream of a horse. Then silence again. You could defend against an army, but not against the weather made human. The psychological blow was worse than the material one. For the first time, Britain's Romanized citizens realized that the empire's borders were just drawings on paper. The barbarians they had mocked for centuries could coordinate, communicate, and cooperate better than the provincial governors who claimed to rule them. The Picts weren't the ghosts beyond the wall anymore. They were the future, knocking on the gates. Contemporary accounts, especially from the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, paint the scene with grim admiration. He writes of simultaneous attacks by land and by sea of towns, sacked forts, raised soldiers slain not by superior force, but by superior cunning. His words almost betray a reluctant respect. The empire had finally met an enemy that fought like the landscape itself. Behind the raids lay organization. Modern scholars now suspect the Picts had developed something akin to a confederation, temporary councils of kings and war leaders who pooled resources for common campaigns. Their ability to synchronize attacks with distant allies suggests messenger scouts and prearranged signals. In a way, they had reverse-engineered the Roman command system using kinship and instinct instead of parchment and ink. The Great Conspiracy was not an accident. It was their masterpiece. For months, Britain burned. The remaining Roman forces, demoralized, unpaid, and leaderless, could only retreat southward, abandoning fort after fort. In Londinium, refugees poured in from the north, spreading stories of painted warriors emerging from mist like ghosts. Commerce faltered, farms went fallow, and the provincial government begged for help from the continent. At last, Rome responded. They sent a man named Count Theodosius, one of those late imperial troubleshooters with more efficiency than imagination. He arrived in 368 CE with fresh troops from Gaul and a simple mandate: restore order or don't come back. Theodosius didn't waste time with speeches. He marched north, reopened supply lines, executed a few corrupt officials for good measure, and rebuilt key fortresses along Hadrian's Wall. The raids slowed, then stopped. By the following spring, the empire could claim technically to have pacified Britain. But Theodosius knew better. The victory was administrative, not cultural. He could drive the Picts back. He couldn't erase what they had proven. Rome's supremacy had cracked, and every tribe from Gaul to Germania had heard the echo. The barbarians had coordinated better than the bureaucracy that despised them. The empire was beginning to learn what it felt like to be the one on defense. In the north, the Picts withdrew without shame. They had no cities to burn, no senators to placate. They returned to their fortresses richer in loot and reputation. The raids had strengthened their political ties, uniting once rival clans into a broader identity. You could almost say Rome had forced them to invent nationhood just to fight it. By the late 4th century, the word Pictland appears in Latin texts, not as myth, but as geography. The people once defined by tattoos were now defined by territory. Even the Romans begrudgingly began to negotiate instead of conquer. They established treaties, exchanged hostages, even paid tributes to northern kings' subsidies dressed up as diplomacy. It was the oldest irony of empire yesterday's barbarians become today's contractors. And while Rome congratulated itself on having restored peace, the Picts were building a world that would outlast them. The Great Conspiracy left ruins behind, yes, but also blueprints. The coordination between northern, western, and eastern raiders planted the seed of a new political reality, a network of northern powers that no longer saw Rome as inevitable. Within a century, the legions would depart Britain forever, and the Picts would rise from rumor to rule. When you stand today on the remains of Hadrian's Wall, you can still sense the echo of that winter. The turf ramparts are softened by grass, the stone towers half swallowed by sheep pasture, yet the air holds a kind of electric memory. It was here that an empire realized it had an expiration date. It was here that the painted people proved that persistence could be strategy. The Romans called it conspiratio, as if rebellion required deceit. But for the Picts, it was simply cooperation, an agreement written not on parchment, but in blood and frost. For one wild season, the north moved as one, and the empire flinched. And when the fires died down and the snow returned, the land went quiet again, quiet, but not the same. The wall still stood, but it no longer divided Rome from chaos. It divided history from its sequel. On one side, the world that would fade. On the other, the world that would remain. When Rome finally pulled its legions from Britain around the early 5th century, the frontier fell silent, but not empty. The forts rotted, the watchfires died, and the empire's banners sagged into the mud. Yet beyond those crumbling stones, the land was alive with new voices. The tribes who had once raided and vanished now settled and ruled. Out of the mist, the Picts began to organize themselves into something remarkable kingdoms. It wasn't the birth of a state as Rome would have understood it. There were no marble capitals, no senators, no minted coins stamped with royal faces. But there were rulers, real ones, and they commanded men trade and memory. Across the northern half of Scotland, the map took shape not in lines, but in stories. The Picts called these territories Cat Circin, Fibsy names we still whisper through the place names that survived them. Caithness, Angus Fife, Inverness. Each kingdom was carved out of landscape itself. To the north, the kingdom of Cait lay along the wind-lashed coastlines of what is now Caithness and Sutherland. It was a hard country, thin soil, fierce seas, but rich in fishstone and determination. Cait's people built fortresses overlooking the Pentland Firth, their walls blackened by storms and smoke. From those cliffs, they looked out not toward Britain, but toward the Orkneys and the open Arctic waters beyond. They were seafarers, traders, and raiders, their horizons set by tides, not borders. Further south, nestled between mountains and rivers, rose the kingdom of sea-modern Inverness Shear and the Great Glen. It was the beating heart of the Highlands, a place of lochs, like mirrors, and valleys that sang with echoes. Sea's kings ruled from fortified hills, Craig Fadrig chief among them, a stronghold whose ramparts of vitrified stone still glitter faintly today, fused by fire more than 1,000 years old. Whether that fire came from construction or conquest, no one knows, but its heat lingers in legend. To the east, in the fertile plains of Angus and the Mearns, lay Serkin, the breadbasket of Pictland. Its fields fed warriors and craftsmen alike. Serkin's rulers were pragmatic. They built where the soil was kind and the rivers deep enough for trade. They were the bridge between the highland and lowland worlds, farmers and diplomats in equal measure. And below them, along the silver ribbon of the Tay, stretched Fib, a kingdom whose name would echo down the centuries as Fife. It was here in the heart of Scotland's gentler east that Pictish civilization reached its greatest refinement. Rich farmland supported dense populations. Trade flowed easily to the sea. Forts rose not just for defense, but for display statements of authority, symbols of power. These weren't borders as we know them. Pictish kings measured power not by land owned, but by people loyal. Territory shifted like the mist won by alliance, lost by marriage, reclaimed by force. Theirs was a political ecosystem of kinship and cunning. Loyalty was sealed, not in contracts, but in feasts, a chieftain offering mead from a silver cup, warriors swearing oaths over a boar's head, the hall roaring as poetry turned lineage into legend. At the center of each kingdom stood a royal fort, a place where politics and spirituality blurred. Picture Burghead, perched on a promontory of the Moray Firth timber-laced ramparts 3 meters thick, encircling a labyrinth of halls, workshops, and storage pits. The sea crashed against its cliffs like applause. Within those walls, artisans worked silver and bronze smiths, hammered weapons, monks, or perhaps druids copied texts, and kings received emissaries from far-off lands. It was both palace and workshop, a microcosm of the Pictish world order carved from wildness. The economy thrived on both soil and sea. Farmers sowed barley and oats in carefully managed fields, the patterns of crop rotation showing a sophistication equal to any Roman estate. Fishermen harvested the cold waters for salmon and herring. Traders carried hides, amber, and carved bone to foreign shores, returning with glass beads from Gaul and fine pottery from the Rhineland. The Picts may have lived at the edge of the known world, but their hands touched the edges of empire, and their culture, always distinct, began to crystallize into something unmistakably their own. Across these kingdoms, the same artistic grammar flourished. Carved stones appeared everywhere, standing like frozen banners, decorated with serpents, crescents, double discs, mirrors, and animals both real and mythic. They spoke a silent language of lineage and ownership. To carve one was to make a claim. This place is ours. These symbols are our blood made visible. It's tempting to imagine a single high king ruling all these realms, but reality was less tidy. The Picts were a confederation, a braided rope of loyalties that could fray or tighten depending on need. A strong ruler might dominate the others for a generation, then the balance would shift again. Yet beneath the rivalry, there was unity of spirit, a shared sense that they were one people distinct from the Gaels to the west, the Britons to the south, and the Norse yet to come. Their system of inheritance was as unusual as their politics. Power passed through the female line, a matrilineal order rare in Europe. A man's claim to kingship rested not on his father, but on his mother's royal blood. It was an arrangement that puzzled outsiders, but served the Picts well. It wove alliances through marriage, preventing dynasties from ossifying. In a sense, queenship ran beneath the surface of every throne. The women who bore royal sons were the silent architects of the kingdom's continuity. Religion, too, was evolving. The old gods still lingered in the groves and springs, but new symbols began to creep into Pictish art: the fish, the cross, the chalice. Christianity had arrived not as conquest, but as conversation. Irish missionaries crossed the seas bringing the teachings of Christ in their satchels, but the Picts listened with selective ears. They took what resonated and painted it in their own colors. Their churches rose near ancient pagan sites. Their monks wrote in scripts that twined with the old spiral motifs. Faith, like everything in the North, was not replaced. It was layered. Everywhere there was a sense of becoming. The 5th and 6th centuries were not dark ages here. They were incandescent with creation. New laws, new alliances, new art, new gods. And through it all, the rhythm of Pictish life beat on the plow in the furrow, the hammer on the anvil, the chant over the mead cup. Outsiders, of course, still saw them as wild. When Irish monks later wrote of their journeys into Pictland, they described a land of mist and marvels, as if the North were more legend than geography. To them, the Picts were the people of twilight, neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, neither fully tribal nor fully regal. But that twilight was exactly where they thrived. For centuries, the Picts had been defined by what they were not Roman, not Celtic, in the Irish sense, not easily categorized. Now at last, they were defining themselves by what they were: a civilization of art and endurance, bound to the land by lineage, and to one another by faith, law, and story. In their hands, Scotland's first national identity was being shaped, not carved in marble, but in granite wood and skin. When the mist rose at dawn, the world saw only hills and heather. But beneath that fog was a living mosaic of kingdoms linked by blood trade and a shared defiance of oblivion. The Romans had called it the edge of the world. The Picts called it home. If you were born a prince among the Picts, your first breath carried a paradox. Your father might be king, but his blood meant nothing without your mother's. In a world ruled by men with spears, it was women who held the keys to legitimacy. The Picts inherited power through the womb, not the sword. Historians call it matrilineal succession. The Picts would have called it common sense. To outsiders, Romans, Gaels, Saxons, it was baffling. A king's son might be noble, yes, but he couldn't inherit the throne unless his mother descended from royal stock. Power passed through the maternal line, weaving a web of alliances and kinships that connected every noble house like threads in a tapestry. It was a system designed not to concentrate power, but to distribute it, to ensure that royal blood was a river, not a well. Why this system emerged, no one can say for sure. Perhaps it was practical. In a world of war and uncertain paternity, one fact could never be disputed: a child's mother. Or perhaps it was older still, a memory of pre-Christian, pre-Celtic traditions, where fertility and sovereignty were personified in goddesses, where the land itself was thought of as female. To rule was to marry the earth, and the queen, whether human or divine, chose her partner. Power flowed from the feminine principle, and the king merely borrowed it for a while. In this world, the Banrag, the queen, was not an ornament beside the throne, she was its foundation. Her status was both political and sacred. A royal woman's marriage could forge peace between rival clans or ignite generations of war. Her children's blood carried the future of the kingdom. Even after her death, her name lingered in the genealogies like a signature on a treaty. It's tempting to imagine the halls of Pictish kings as arenas of male boasting, but behind every feast, behind every coronation, the invisible work of women held it all together. A sister's marriage might secure a fragile border. A mother's counsel might prevent a civil war. The monks who later wrote the chronicles rarely recorded their names, but archaeology whispers their presence. On carved stones across Pictland, female figures appear again and again enthroned beside kings, or standing alone larger than life. Some hold mirrors and comb symbols long assumed to represent vanity, but many scholars now believe these were emblems of sovereignty and reflection, markers of wisdom and continuity. The mirror reflected not the self, but the soul of the kingdom. The comb tamed the wild hair chaos fate itself. In Pictish religion, womanhood and divinity were intertwined. Long before Christianity took root, the land was believed to be ruled by a goddess, perhaps an ancestral earth mother, perhaps many local spirits merged into one. Each region likely had its own lady of the land, to whom offerings were made at wells and rivers. When a new king rose to power, he symbolically united with this goddess through ritual, sometimes, literally, through a high priestess who embodied her. It was theology as politics, marriage as mandate. Even after conversion to Christianity, echoes of this sacred femininity persisted. Saints replaced goddesses, but not entirely. The cult of Saint Bridget, for instance, flourished in the north, not merely as imported Irish piety, but as continuity, a Christian gloss on an older veneration of the spring goddess breed. Women's holy wells remained pilgrimage sites long after monks arrived, their waters believed to heal, to bless, to foretell. The matrilineal system shaped everything: succession, diplomacy, even architecture. Royal genealogists kept meticulous oral records of descent through mothers' names, reciting them like poetry at assemblies. Lineage wasn't a cold list. It was a living rhythm, and because royal status could pass through sisters as easily as through sons, the palace became a hive of competing ambitions, not just among men, but among dynasties of women who maneuvered through marriages and alliances. Picture a great hall at Scone or Burghead in the 6th century. At its center, the firelight dances on bronze vessels and silver brooches. The king sits at the high seat, yes, but behind him, at his shoulder, stands the queen, her cloak pinned with a jeweled brooch, depicting a crescent and V-rod, the mark of divine authority. She does not speak often, but when she does, the men fall silent. In her eyes, alliances are counted. In her memory, grudges are stored. Her presence reminds everyone that kingship is borrowed grace, and that the throne is only as stable as the women who anchor it. It was a system that bred stability in chaos, but also intrigue. When a ruler died without a clear maternal heir, claimants multiplied like thistles after rain. Rival branches of the royal line invoked competing female ancestors, sometimes reaching absurd distances through time and imagination. Wars of succession were fought as much with words as with weapons, genealogical duels recited by bards and priests before a council of nobles. Bloodlines, not ballots, decided everything. To trace the right mother could mean a crown. In later centuries, Christian clerics would record the Pictish rule of the mothers with faint disapproval. To them, inheritance through women seemed unnatural, even heretical. But in truth, it was deeply pragmatic, an insurance policy against extinction. When a dynasty's male line failed, the maternal branch preserved legitimacy. It was not feminism, it was foresight. Beyond politics, this reverence for female lineage left fingerprints on art and myth. In the ornamentation of brooches and stones, spirals and knots often enclose seed-like forms, symbols of creation, fertility, continuity. The act of carving itself, chiseling stone into life, mirrored birth. The Picts seemed to understand that to make something enduring required the patience of creation, the slow pulse of the maternal. Even the landscape carried her mark. Hills and lochs bore names tied to queens and goddesses. Lochbride Ben Necton and the River Dee, each place a feminine echo, a reminder that geography itself was gendered. To live on the land was to live within her body. To betray her through greed, cruelty, neglect, was to risk famine or defeat. When later kings of Alba the Scots, who absorbed the Picts, shifted succession to the father's line, something vital was lost. The maternal thread that had once kept power balanced became patriarchal chainmail, stronger in the short term, but colder, more brittle. Yet the memory of that older order never fully vanished. Even centuries later, Scottish folklore would recall the true heir through the mother's kin, as though some ancestral echo still whispered that legitimacy flows from the womb, not the sword. The rule of the mothers was not a matriarchy in the modern sense. It was subtler, older, woven into myth as much as law. It reflected a worldview where balance, not dominance, sustained life. The masculine conquered, the feminine continued. Together, they formed the rhythm of endurance that had always defined the Picts. And in the end, that might be why their civilization lasted as long as it did, centuries of storms, invasions, and change, and still left marks on stone that refused to fade. Because a people who trace their power through mothers never truly vanish. They endure in the blood, in the ground, in the quiet resilience of everything that grows again after winter. Every people eventually write their history in the names of kings, though for the Picts, the ink was fire and stone. Their earliest monarchs straddle that misty border between legend and record, half remembered by monks, half imagined by poets. What survives is not so much a list as a rhythm, a chant echoing through the centuries. Drust, Talorg, Nectan, Bridi, Gartnite. Names carved into memory, each one flickering briefly against the dark before vanishing into it again. The first of these ghostly rulers, so far as any scribe could guess, was Drust, son of Erp, a figure said to have reigned for 100 years. It's the kind of number that tells you you're reading poetry, not politics, but the kernel of truth glows inside the exaggeration. Drust was remembered as a warrior king who brought unity out of chaos, a conqueror whose campaigns stitched together the patchwork tribes of the north into something resembling a single people. If he was real, and most historians believe he was somewhere in the 5th century, then he was the Pictish Charlemagne before Charlemagne ever existed. The chronicles tell us that Drust fought 100 battles. Whether that means a century of skirmishes or simply a man who never stopped fighting, we can't be sure. But the image is vivid, a ruler whose life was one long campaign, not for territory, but for legitimacy. In the ruins of his fortresses, Burghead, Craig, Fadraig, Tap O'Nuth, you can still see the outlines of ambition. They stand high and wind-bitten, where fire once licked the stone ramparts and the air rang with the clang of iron. The Picts built to be seen from afar, to remind anyone approaching by sea or valley that the land was claimed, that kingship here burned bright. After Drust came others, Talorc, Necton, Gartnite, names repeating across centuries like a family of echoes. Pictish kings didn't invent new names. They inherited them as if identity itself were sacred property. The repetition was deliberate. Every new Necton called back to an older one, binding the present to the mythic past. Each coronation was both a beginning and a reenactment. To rule Pictland was to step into a lineage of memory, not merely blood. Coronation itself was no simple affair. It took place at sacred sites such as Scone or Dunsinane Hill, where the earth itself was treated as witness. There was no golden crown or jeweled scepter, only the stone of destiny upon which the king would stand barefoot, symbolically marrying the land. Around him, Druids, or priests, chanted the genealogies that connected him to ancient forebears and to the goddess of sovereignty who sanctified his rule. When he raised his sword to the assembled nobles, it was less a gesture of power than a promise to defend the land, as husband defends wife, or rather, as the land defends itself. These early monarchs were not monarchs in the Roman sense. Their authority was both absolute and fragile absolute within their domains, fragile beyond them. Each king ruled through alliances and charisma rather than bureaucratic control. A Pictish ruler could command warriors to fight, but not farmers to pay taxes. He was first among equals, a mediator between chieftains, a living link between heaven, earth, and hearth. His strength came from the loyalty of the noble families beneath him, loyalty earned through gifts, marriages, and victory. Fail at any of those, and a king could find himself deposed by the same council that had lifted him up. To keep loyalty burning, kings turned to spectacle. The royal feast was as much political theater as celebration. Picture a great timber hall on a stormy night, the fire roaring smoke curling toward a hole in the roof, the scent of roasted boar thick in the air. The king sits beneath a hanging shield emblazoned with the serpent emblem of his line. Around him, nobles drink from horn cups, musicians pluck the lyre, and storytellers sing of ancestors who turned battles into legends. At such feasts, alliances were made and broken over the tilt of a drinking horn. The gift of a golden brooch could bind one family for a lifetime. A single insult could start a war. Despite the political instability, something solid was forming. Each reign added another layer of ritual and culture. The king became less a warrior and more a symbol, part lawgiver, part priest. It was under rulers like Necton Morbet in the early 7th century that the first Christian influences truly penetrated the court. Churches were built alongside pagan shrines. Monks copied psalms in Latin, while carvers still etched serpents into granite. The Picts never replaced. They absorbed. Under Necton's successors, the court would eventually adopt Christianity fully, but its old heartbeat still thumped beneath the cross. The archaeological record tells its own story. Across Pictland, royal centers grew in complexity. At Rhynie, archaeologists found imported Roman wine amphorae and fragments of glass evidence that these kings were plugged into long-distance trade networks, their halls stocked with luxury goods. At Fort Teviot in Strathmore, the remains of vast fortifications suggest that these were not humble chieftains' villages, but regional capitals with hundreds of inhabitants. Power was becoming centralized and kingship institutionalized. The Picts were quietly joining the broader medieval world, even as they kept their individuality intact. What's remarkable is how they marked that transition, not with documents, but with art. The symbol stones that rise from the soil across Scotland are not graves. They are monuments of authority. Many scholars now believe they commemorate royal deeds or dynastic claims. A double disc and Z-rod might signify the union of two houses. A crescent might mark territory claimed by divine right. Each carving was both a political statement and a theological one. In a world where literacy was rare, stone became the script of kings. In those centuries, leadership wasn't hereditary so much as performative. A king had to prove his worth in battle, but also in generosity, wisdom, and faith. The ideal ruler was a balance of opposites, fierce yet just devout, yet pragmatic warrior and poet alike. It's little wonder that later Scottish legends, Arthurian tales, Celtic cycles borrowed freely from Pictish prototypes. The archetype of the wise, tragic northern king likely began here in the smoky halls of these stone and fire monarchs. And yet, for all their grandeur, their legacy is fragile. No chronicles written in Pictish survive. Their histories were oral, carried in the mouths of bards, whose words dissolved when the last of them fell silent. What remains are ruins, and runes carvings and chronicles written by strangers trying to make sense of them. But if you visit the sites where they once ruled Burghead's clifftop Fort Scone's sacred hill, you can still feel the pulse of their authority. It hums in the ground, quiet but steady, like a heartbeat deep beneath the stone. In later centuries, scribes would scoff that the Picts kept the customs of their mothers and worshipped beasts. But in truth, these early kings were the architects of Scottish identity, blending Celtic myth, native independence, and Roman sophistication into something unique. They were monarchs of paradox rulers who governed without palaces, whose laws were sung, whose symbols outlived their words. Kings of stone, because their monuments still rise from the earth. Kings of fire, because their memory still burns through the fog of history. No written book remains to tell the story of the Picts. Their words, whatever they sounded like, blew away with the northern wind. Yet the Picts themselves found another kind of script, one that needed no parchment, no ink, and no translation. They carved their chronicles into the bones of the earth. Across the highlands and lowlands of Scotland, scattered through glens and fields and churchyards, hundreds of great stones still stand, their surfaces carved with crescents, rods, serpents, and creatures of such stylized grace that they seem to breathe even now. These are the Pictish symbol stones, and they are as close as we will ever come to reading the Picts in their own hand. They are not tombstones, not exactly. Some mark boundaries, others commemorate power. Some may have been gifts to the gods or to ancestors. All share one mysterious fact: they speak in images instead of words, as if the Picts were less interested in recording events than in coding meaning. Where the Romans wrote, "Emperor so-and-so conquered such and such," the Picts left behind a crescent pierced by a V-rod. And somehow, that feels more honest. Archaeologists group the stones into three classes. Class 1 are the oldest unshaped boulders with symbols scratched in shallow linework, often weathered smooth by centuries of rain. They belong to the age before Christianity, when sacred art was still born of pagan silence. Their carvings are clean, geometric, almost mathematical crescents, double discs, zed rods, mirror, and comb sets. Each image looks deliberate, as though arranged to form sentences in a language we no longer understand. But even without knowing the grammar, we can sense the rhythm. The crescent and V-rod, perhaps the most famous of all, may represent the waxing and waning moon, or the union of earth and sky, or a symbol of kinship between clans. The double disc and Z-rod seems to suggest connection, two worlds linked by a bolt of energy, maybe the seen and the unseen. The serpent writhes across stone as if alive. The eagle spreads its wings as though mid-swoop. The mirror and comb, often paired with female figures, might speak of lineage or status, or of the goddess whose reflection sanctified kingship. The meaning is gone, but the precision remains. These were not doodles. They were declarations. Class 2 stones belong to the age of transition, roughly the 6th to 8th centuries, when Christianity began to entwine with native belief. These slabs are shaped and dressed the symbols carved in bold relief rather than in sized lines. Across their surfaces, the old signs coexist with new imagery: crosses, apostles' angels, deer entwined with serpents, warriors on horseback. The two worlds, pagan and Christian, aren't at war here. They are dancing, merging into something uniquely Pictish. It's theology as art compromise turned into beauty. The great cross slabs of Aberlemno or Duplin show this fusion at its most breathtaking. On one side, a monumental cross filled with interlaced knots and beasts whose tails become vines. On the other, scenes of battle and hunting, kings enthroned, harpists playing. These are not shy converts timidly replacing the old gods. These are people taking the cross, and carving it their way, turning salvation into sculpture. If the monks of Ireland illuminated books, the Picts illuminated granite. By the 9th century came Class 3, stones entirely Christian, their surfaces devoted to crosses and biblical scenes, the old symbols fading into memory. Yet even then, something distinctly Pictish lingered in the style, the endless knots, the sense of motion within stillness, the geometry that feels halfway between prayer and mathematics. The last of these stones marks the moment the Pictish soul was baptized into Scotland, but it also marks its survival frozen in ornament. What makes the stones so haunting isn't just their artistry, though that is staggering, but their voice. They are quite literally the Picts speaking across 1,200 years, telling us things we can almost but not quite decipher. Each symbol seems to whisper, "You were never meant to understand me completely." And maybe that's the point. The Picts didn't carve for tourists or archaeologists. They carved for time itself, trusting that mystery was stronger than memory. Imagine one of those stones when it was new, not moss-cloaked and gray, but gleaming. The grooves, filled with red ochre or chalk, standing tall beside a road or a fort. A traveler would have stopped and traced the lines with their fingers, recognizing the marks of their clan, the territory they'd entered, or the ancestors who ruled there. Each symbol was both signpost and signature, the map and the myth of the people who made it. The skill required was immense. Pictish sculptors chose their stone carefully fine-grained sandstone for delicate carving granite for grandeur. They used iron chisels and hammers working the surface until it seemed to breathe light. Many stones show evidence of grids and compass marks as if the artists planned their compositions with mathematical precision. This was geometry in devotion, an art born of intellect as much as intuition. And it wasn't just public art. Small carved stones and metal objects, pins, plaques, mirror backs, carry miniature versions of the same motifs. It's as though the symbols weren't confined to monuments. They were woven into everyday life talismans of identity and protection. In a world where literacy was rare, these emblems were a visual vocabulary everyone could read. We don't know who the carvers were. Some may have been monks trained in monasteries, others hereditary craftsmen serving royal courts. But we do know they were revered. To give form to the invisible was holy work. Each carving session likely began with ritual, the artist fasting or offering a libation before striking the first blow. To carve into stone was to converse with eternity. Even now, standing before one of these monuments, Aberlemno Maiden Stone Sueños Stone Shandwick, you can feel the air shift. The cymbals hum faintly like frozen music. Birds nest in the cracks, rain fills the grooves, yet the language endures. No invader ever smashed them, no empire ever repurposed them. They survived by being too strange to destroy. In a way, the symbol stones are the Pictish equivalent of the pyramids, not in scale, but in purpose. Both are attempts to cheat oblivion. Yet while Egypt's monuments shout, the Picts whisper. They hide meaning in pattern, not proclamation. You don't read a Pictish stone, you listen to it. And if you listen long enough, you start to hear what they were really saying. Not the specifics of lineage or law, but something simpler, more enduring. We were here. We shaped the earth with our hands. We mattered. The Romans left ruins. The Gaels left legends. But the Picts left sentences carved into silence. Their words are weather-worn, their grammar gone, yet the stones still speak in the universal tongue of persistence. When the wind brushes across their faces, it sounds almost like breath. The painted people who vanished from history's pages never truly vanished at all. They just changed mediums. Their story moved from flesh to rock. And unlike skin rock does not fade, If you close your eyes and imagine Pictland at its height, don't picture endless battlefields or grim chieftains skulking in smoky halls. Picture instead the gleam of molten metal, the smell of charcoal and beeswax, the rhythmic tapping of hammers echoing from wooden workshops. The Picts, for all their reputation as warriors and mystics, were also artists, masters of transformation. They took the raw stuff of their harsh land, stone, bronze, silver, and coaxed it into eternity. Archaeologists call it the Pictish metalworking miracle. From the 5th to the 8th centuries, a surge of artistry radiated from their kingdoms, astonishingly sophisticated for a people without cities or coinage. They left behind hoards of jewelry and weapon fittings so refined that even Rome, at its most decadent, might have blushed with envy. These weren't ornaments of luxury, they were declarations of identity, the shining handwriting of a civilization that believed beauty was a form of power. The best surviving example lies buried and reborn at Norreys Law in Fife, a treasure hoard unearthed by accident in the 19th century. Over 100 objects, chains, brooches, plaques, ingots, and ornaments, all worked in pure silver. Imagine the sight of it when it was new, the treasure room shimmering like captured moonlight. There are broad chains, each link the size of a man's thumb, designed to drape across the chest of a king. Massive brooches engraved with spirals and beasts. Plaques hammered thin, as bark embossed with complex knotwork that catches every glint of torchlight. Each object, whispers of hands that understood metal, not as matter, but as music. And the most haunting question remains, why bury it? Was it hidden during a raid, an offering to the gods, or a royal treasury sealed for the afterlife? We will never know. But every hoard at Norreys Law, at St. Ninian's Isle, at Gallcross, speaks of both prosperity and peril. The Picts lived close to the edge of violence. Perhaps they understood that beauty survives best underground. The metalworkers themselves occupied a place between priest and magician. Their furnaces were temples, their tools extensions of will. They knew how to smelt silver from ore, how to inlay bronze with red enamel, how to twist wire into intricate filigree without breaking it. A single torque or broach might take weeks to finish every curve, exact every dot of stippling deliberate. And because metalwork outlived flesh, these artisans were more than craftsmen, they were chroniclers. Each object they made became part of the kingdom's memory. Even their techniques were alchemy. In some finds, silver seems to flow like liquid light across bronze bases, creating a shimmering contrast that changes as you move. They employed a method called repoussé hammering designs, from the reverse side combined with engraving, punching, and chasing. Many of their brooches feature beasts locked in eternal loops, stags, boars, dragons, sea monsters whose tails coil into their mouths. The symbolism is unmistakable. Life devouring death, death birthing life, an endless circle rendered in metal. The artistry wasn't confined to jewelry. They decorated weapons, harnesses, and household tools with the same reverence. A sword wasn't merely a blade, it was an heirloom, its hilt etched with the same symbols found on sacred stones. A drinking horn might be banded in silver and carved with knotwork that twisted like vines around the rim. Even mirrors, objects of mystery in their culture, were polished to such a high sheen that they could reflect candlelight like daylight. To the Picts, craftsmanship was never trivial. It was the language of continuity. Trade flowed through this artistry. Silver, unlike gold, had to be imported, most of it likely coming through trade routes from Ireland, the Hebrides, and even the Norse world. Some was repurposed from hacked-up Roman coins, melted and reborn. The Picts were recycling empire into elegance. Roman authority might have crumbled, but its silver still sang in Pictish hands. Imagine a royal feast in the 7th century. The king seated beneath a banner of boar, hide his warriors in cloaks clasped by heavy silver pins. The hall glows with the flicker of oil lamps reflected on metal platters, chalices, sword pommels, chains. Everything gleams. The musicians play harps, the storytellers chant genealogies, and the king's chain, nearly 5 kilograms of twisted silver, catches every spark of firelight. It is not decoration. It is sovereignty condensed into a single object. When the chain moves, the kingdom listens. At the same time, smaller treasures were worn by commoners, bronze brooches and pins decorated with simplified motifs, echoes of royal splendor, made affordable through imitation. In this way, art became democratic. The same spirals and beasts that adorned kings also circled the wrists of farmers and fishermen. Identity was not just declared from the throne, it was worn at the hearth. Many of these treasures ended their journey in ritual concealment. Hoards like St. Ninian's Isle, discovered in 1958 beneath a church floor in Shetland, contain a breathtaking collection of silver bowls, cups, brooches, and weapon fittings. They were buried carefully wrapped in cloth, as if meant for the eyes of gods rather than men. The Christian symbols on them, crosses, chalices, blend seamlessly with older spiral motifs. The craftsmen of the North never erased the old faith. They folded it into the new one layer upon shining layer. There is something deeply human about that. The Picts did not build pyramids or cathedrals. They left no libraries, no written archives. But in every twist of silver and bronze, they left a theology of endurance. Their art says, "You can erase our names, but not our hands." Even today, when you stand before a Pictish chain or brooch in a museum case, its surface still radiant, after more than a millennium, you can feel the heat that made it. The temperature of creation still hums within the metal. It's as if those long-dead smiths poured not just silver into their molds, but themselves. And in a way they did. When their kings fell, their forts burned, and their language faded, these objects remained. They were carried through wars, traded across seas, buried unearthed, and cherished anew. Through them, we meet the Picts, not as myth or mystery, but as hands that shaped the intractable, that coaxed the cold metal of the North into tenderness. So when we speak of the artisans of the North, we are not talking about anonymous craftsmen lost to time. We are talking about philosophers and iron poets, in bronze, dreamers in silver. Their workshop was their cathedral, their hammer, their pen, their furnace, their heart. And as the last embers of their fires cooled, they left behind a truth far more enduring than conquest, that to make beauty in a harsh world is itself an act of defiance. And, by the 7th century, the land of the Picts stood at a strange crossroads. Their kings ruled from timber halls crowned with smoke. Their warriors rode beneath carved boar banners. Their artisans shaped silver into immortal spirals. But somewhere amid the clang of iron and the whisper of old gods, a new sound began to drift across the northern sea's bells. Faint at first, then closer, clearer. The sound of monasteries being born. Christianity came to Pictland not with armies, but with travelers. Missionaries from Ireland, carrying little more than manuscripts and conviction, crossed the waters in coracles, those fragile leather boats that seemed held together by faith alone. Among them was St. Columba, the man who would become the bridge between two worlds, the twilight of pagan Pictland and the dawn of Christian Scotland. Columba, or Columcille, was an Irish monk of fierce intellect and fiercer temper, a man once exiled for causing a war over a disputed manuscript, who turned his punishment into pilgrimage. In 563 CE, he landed on a small, windswept island called Iona. To the Picts, Iona was near the edge of the world, where the ocean folds into the sky. To Columba, it was a frontier not of geography, but of souls. From here, He and his followers would radiate faith northward like torchlight through fog. The chronicles describe his meeting with King Bride, son of Maelchon, the powerful ruler of northern Pictland, around 565 CE. Bride ruled from a fortress at Craig Fadrig overlooking the Bearley Firth, a site already ancient when Columba arrived. Picture the scene: a walled hill fort, rising above pine forests, banners fluttering guards in mail, and blue tattoos at the gates. Into this pagan court walked a tonsured monk in rough wool, clutching not a sword, but a psalter. The tale preserved by the monk Adamnan, a century later, reads like theater. Bride's gates were shut against Columba, but the saint prayed, made the sign of the cross, and miraculously, the chronicler insists, the doors swung open of their own accord. The guards fell back astonished. Bride, half intrigued, half unsettled, received him. The two men talked for hours, maybe days, through interpreters, through gestures, through mutual curiosity. We don't know what was said. But when Columba left, Bride was no longer an enemy of the new faith. Whether he converted that day or simply tolerated it, Christianity had found its way inside Pictish walls. It's tempting to dramatize this as a clean victory of crossover crescent, but history rarely paints in absolutes. Conversion was not conquest, it was negotiation. The old gods didn't vanish overnight. They were folded, adapted, renamed. The Picts accepted Christianity the same way they accepted everything else, on their own terms, quietly reworking it until it fit the rhythm of their world. In the early monasteries that sprang up after Columba, Portmahomac, Deir Abernethy, and others, monks wrote in Latin, but thought in Pictish. Their manuscripts shimmered with the same interlaced patterns that adorned pagan jewelry and standing stones. The cross, that stark symbol of suffering and salvation, blossomed under their hands into something living, its arms twined with vines, beasts, and spirals. To the Pictish imagination, even Christ's sacrifice became geometry. The monks of these northern outposts were not cloistered scholars in ivory towers. They were artisans and diplomats living on the wild edge of faith. They copied texts by hand, taught literacy to local nobles, and turned the act of writing into a kind of worship. Their illuminated manuscripts, now mostly lost, though fragments survive, must have glowed like northern light. Each page a storm of color and precision, a hymn in ink. Christianity also brought something subtler: organization. The Church offered an invisible network, linking distant Pictish kingdoms to a wider spiritual community. Priests became diplomats. Monasteries became centers of administration and learning. Baptism replaced initiation rites, but the underlying purpose was the same: to bind the people through shared ritual. The fusion of old and new was sometimes literal. Many symbol stones from this period bear both pagan motifs and Christian crosses carved on the same surface. A serpent coils beside a crucifix. A crescent shelters a fish. To later theologians, this might look like contradiction. To the Picts, it was harmony. The cross didn't erase their gods, it joined them at the table. Salvation, after all, was easier to accept when it spoke your own language. Columba's followers, abbots, bishops, and hermits, spread across the land. They traveled light, a staff, a book, and sometimes a relic. They built wooden chapels on the sites of ancient shrines, consecrating what was already sacred. In this way, the new faith grew not by uprooting, but by grafting. Springs dedicated to goddesses became holy wells of saints. Hilltop altars, once used for sacrifice, became places of prayer. The holy remained holy, only the names changed. And beneath this gentle revolution, something profound shifted in Pictish consciousness. The coming of Christianity gave them a written alphabet, at last Latin. With it came the ability to preserve names, laws, blessings, and curses. What had once been oral became tangible. The people who had carved symbols for centuries now began to carve letters. The world was learning to read the Picts, and the Picts were learning to read themselves. Of course, not everyone embraced the change. In the north and northeast, the old faiths lingered longer. Some kings, perhaps fearing the loss of divine authority, resisted conversion. A few monasteries were burned in retaliation. Others quietly disappeared. Yet by the late 7th century, the tide had turned irrevocably. The cross had become as common as the crescent, and prayers in Latin rose with the morning smoke from halls once dedicated to thunder gods. The new religion also reshaped politics. Christian kings were now crowned with ecclesiastical blessing, their reigns recorded by monks rather than minstrels. Churches became royal propaganda, their walls etched with crosses that gleamed like symbols of legitimacy. To be a Christian king was to be civilized in the eyes of Ireland and Northumbria, to join the fellowship of Christendom without losing the flavor of the mist. And yet, if you walk among the ruins of an old Pictish chapel today, you can still sense the dual heartbeat beneath the stones. A cross carved beside a serpent, a fish beside a crescent moon. The wind through the broken doorway sounds almost like chanting in two languages, at once one Latin, one lost. That was Pictish Christianity, not the replacement of one world by another, but a duet between faiths. By the time Columba died in 597 CE, the groundwork was set. The painted people were now a people of the cross, yet still painted, still proud, still singing in the voice of their ancestors. They had managed what few civilizations ever do to absorb a new religion without erasing their soul. Their art grew richer, their politics stronger, their vision wider. In trading idols for icons, they did not lose their magic, they refined it. And as the monks on Iona rang their bells across the sea, the echoes reached every glen and valley of the north. A new light had come to Pictland, soft as dawn, but unextinguishable. The land of stones and symbols had found its next great symbol, the cross, and it shone not as an ending, but as a continuation of everything that had come before. By the dawn of the 8th century, the sound of chanting replaced the clash of swords in many corners of Pictland. The old warrior halls did not vanish, but beside them, quiet sanctuaries grew. Monks took up the hammer and quill as their weapons, shaping faith in parchment and pigment. The Picts, once famous for painting their skin, now painted the Word of God. These were not monks in stone abbeys or grand cathedrals. Their world was still timber turf and mist. A monastery in Pictland was more a village than a fortress, a ring of beehive huts, a chapel of wood or rough stone gardens, of herbs and barley, a smithy for crafting chalices and bells. The air would have smelled of wax and parchment smoke and honey, and everywhere the low hum of human patience, the rhythm of devotion that built a new kind of kingdom. The finest of these early monasteries rose at Port Mahomet on the Tarbat Peninsula, a lonely spit of land jutting into the North Sea. When archaeologists uncovered it, they found evidence of workshops, furnaces, and the ghostly remains of a scriptorium, a room for writing. Here in the far north, Pictish monks had copied Latin manuscripts, illuminating the pages with knotwork so intricate that even the angels would have needed magnifying glasses. These monks lived at the edge of the world, yet their minds were wide as eternity. To imagine their daily life is to imagine both simplicity and splendor. At dawn, the bell called them from sleep. They prayed facing the sunrise, then worked the fields or tended the cattle. In the afternoons, they carved, painted, and wrote. At night, they chanted psalms until the stars seemed to listen. Each word written on vellum was an act of resistance against silence. Every illuminated letter, a golden A, a curling P, was both prayer and proclamation. The Picts had found a new way to make art eternal, not on stone this time, but on calfskin parchment stretched and smoothed, glowing under candlelight. The monastery at Port Mahomac was not alone. Across Pictland, smaller communities thrived at Deir Abernethy, Restoneth Monophyeth, and beyond. Each was a flicker of the same great flame. Some were founded by Irish missionaries, others by Pictish kings eager to cloak their rule in divine legitimacy. Each became a hub of learning, healing, and diplomacy. In an age when kings could not read, monks were the memory of nations. Among their most precious legacies is the Book of Deir, a small gospel manuscript from the 10th century that still whispers in Pictish Gaelic marginal notes. Though it was copied after the classical Pictish age, it preserves the faint echo of their voice. In its margins, monks scribbled land grants and blessings in a hybrid tongue, half Latin, half Northern Gaelic, tracing the shift from Pictland to Alba. It is the only surviving manuscript to carry words written by people of the Pictish world. In its faded ink, we can almost hear their accents soft as the rain on heather. But the monasteries were not only libraries, they were laboratories of miracles. The saints who walked their cloisters became legends as strange and vivid as the pagan heroes they replaced. Saint Drustin Columba's companion was said to have wept so fiercely at parting from his friend that a spring burst from the ground where his tears fell. Saint Fergus, a missionary bishop, supposedly left the imprint of his knees on a rock where he prayed for conversion of the northern tribes. And Saint Ninian, whose name clings to countless chapels, was remembered for turning dark wells to sweet water with a gesture of his hand. To the Pictish mind, these were not contradictions of faith, but confirmations of continuity. The same landscape that once echoed with druids and spirits now echoed with saints who spoke the same language of wonder. In their miracles, nature remained alive, obedient, but never silent. Christianity here did not crush the old world, it sanctified it. Every spring, every stone, every whisper of wind could still hold the sacred. Art mirrored this union. The cross slabs of the period at Aberlemno-Magel and Hilton of Cadball are masterpieces of devotion and design. On one side, a cross carved in swirling relief. On the other, scenes of hunts battles and processions. Kings on horseback ride beneath angels. Stags and serpents coil in eternal chase. The boundary between myth and gospel blurs so gently you forget it ever existed. The Picts, in carving the cross, also carved themselves into salvation's story. The monastic craftsmen were the inheritors of the old metal workers and stone carvers, but their art aimed higher than royalty it reached for the divine. Their chalices were as luminous as their old torques, their shrines as intricate as their symbol stones. The same patterns of knotwork that once adorned pagan jewelry now wound around the names of saints. To look at a Pictish gospel page was to see faith rendered as geometry, a visual theology of endless interconnection. And beyond artistry came diplomacy. The monasteries became bridges between kingdoms. Monks educated the sons of nobles, arranged truces, carried messages between rulers. In the 8th century, Iona's influence extended far into Pictish territory, forging a shared spiritual identity that would later unite Picts and Scots into a single Christian nation. Faith was becoming infrastructure, but it was not a tranquil faith. The monastery walls were not always enough to hold back the violence of the age. In 781 CE, the Annals of Ulster record that the slaughter of the monks of Iona was carried out by raiders from the north, perhaps rival tribes, perhaps early Norsemen testing the coast. Across the sea, Viking sails had begun to glint on the horizon, and the serenity of the scriptorium would soon be shattered by axes. Yet even that coming storm could not erase what had been built. For the Picts, the fusion of faith and art was complete. The new religion had not merely conquered them, it had been absorbed, translated, and adorned until it spoke their language fluently. In their illuminated pages and crossstones, one can feel the heartbeat of a people who believed that beauty itself was a form of worship. Picture then a monk at twilight in Port Mahomac, hunched over a parchment, dipping his quill in oak gall ink. Outside, the sea breathes against the shore. Gulls wheel in the dying light. He writes slowly, carefully, the loops of his letters echoing the curves of ancient Pictish knots. Around him, the world is changing. Kings rise and fall. Old gods sleep, but the ink glides on. Each stroke is a prayer against forgetting. That monk, nameless and unseen, is as much the voice of the Picts as any warrior or king. Through his quill, their story survived the centuries of silence that followed. The miracles, the manuscripts, the cross, and the crescent, they all became one continuous line drawn by steady hands in a trembling world. And though the candle will eventually burn out, its smoke will rise through the roof hole, twisting upward like an illuminated letter ascending into the stars. The story of the Picts, once carved in stone, now glows in ink and faith. The land of symbols had learned to write. By the middle of the 7th century, the monasteries had multiplied, the cross had settled among the hills, and silver chains once worn by kings gleamed on the altars of saints. The Picts were no longer the shadowy tribes the Romans had called savages. They were organized, literate, and very aware of their power. And in this world of faith and fire, one king would rise who would make all of northern Britain tremble. Bridi mac Bili, the man who united the painted people and struck fear into the ironclad hearts of Northumbria. Bride was born into the bloodlines of both Pict and Britain, the son of a Welsh prince, fostered among the northern Picts, and educated perhaps by monks who taught him scripture alongside strategy. His upbringing was the perfect storm: Romanized discipline from the south, wild resilience from the north, and a shrewd understanding of how to survive between larger powers. When he came to the throne, around 671 CE, Pictland was divided, its many small kingdoms tugging in different directions, and its southern border constantly tested by the mighty Anglo-Saxon realm of Northumbria. Bride understood what none before him had managed to grasp, that the Picts could no longer afford to be a dozen scattered peoples. The age of the hillfort had to become the age of the crown. He ruled from Fortriu, near modern Inverness, but his reach extended far beyond. He sent envoys, south warriors west, and priests everywhere. Where others saw isolation, Bride saw geography as defense. The mountains, the rivers, the shifting fog, these were his walls. Our main source for his reign comes from the venerable Bede, that calm and somewhat patronizing Anglo-Saxon monk who wrote in Latin from his cozy monastery in Jarrow. To Bede, the Picts were still exotic painted relics of a pagan past, but he couldn't hide his admiration for Bridi's cunning. Under this king of the northern Picts, Bede wrote many of the southern Picts were subdued. That was monk speak, for he's conquering everyone in sight. Bridi's genius lay in turning religion into diplomacy. He strengthened ties with Iona and other Christian centers, using monks as ambassadors of peace and spies of convenience. Through the church, he built alliances. Through war, he built fear. Every monastery he patronized became a foothold of legitimacy. The saints prayed for his victory, and his victory funded their sanctuaries. The balance of sword and psalm had rarely been so perfectly tuned. But Bridi's name would be written into eternity for one single roaring moment, the Battle of Dunashin fought in the summer of 685 CE. It was one of those rare battles that truly change history, not because of its size, but because of its symbolism. It marked the end of Northumbria's northern ambitions and the high tide of Pictish power. The enemy was formidable, King Ecgfrith of Northumbria, a proud, restless ruler whose armies had already crushed the Britons of Strathclyde and subjugated much of southern Scotland. Ecgfrith believed himself unstoppable. The chroniclers say he had a taste for expansion that outstripped his caution. Brede, watching from the north, saw opportunity in arrogance. The two kings had clashed before at a place called Two Rivers, where Brede suffered a setback but survived. Now, a decade later, he was ready for the reckoning. He lured Ecgfrith north into the wild country of Angus, promising either a rebellion to crush or tribute to claim. The Anglo-Saxon king took the bait. He marched his army deep into Pictish lands, his soldiers armored and confident banners fluttering like the wings of caged hubris. Dunishan Hill rises near Forfar, a lonely prominence surrounded by bog and moor. The battlefield must have been a trap disguised as open country. The Picts, masters of terrain, waited hidden in the high ground and marshy hollows. As Ecgfrith's forces advanced, the ground itself betrayed them wet, uneven, impossible for cavalry. The Pictish war horns cried out, and Brede's warriors surged from the mist, their faces daubed once again in blue and black echoes of ancestors long gone. To the men of Northumbria, it must have felt like the land itself had come alive to devour them. Arrows hissed from ridges, spears struck from shadows. The Picts fought in organized companies, now not the scattered raiders of Roman memory, but disciplined infantry, armed with long spears and light shields. They used the bogs and the hills to their advantage, herding the invaders into narrow ground, where movement became panic. Bede tells us that Ecgfrith was slain, and very few of his army returned. No flowery prose, just the grim understatement of total defeat. The king's body was never found. Perhaps it sank into the marshes of Dunishan. Perhaps the Picts buried him in secret as a warning to others. The battlefield ran with rain and legend. The empire of Northumbria had reached its northern limit, and the painted people had painted victory once more. In the aftermath, Brede stood at the height of power. The Pictish kingdom stretched from the Forth to the Orkneys. Its kings obeyed its borders secure. He commanded tribute from neighboring realms and opened trade anew with the Irish and Norse seas. Monks recorded his triumph as divine justice proof that prideful kings fall, and the meek, or at least the mist-dwellers, inherit the earth. But Brede was no meek man. He ruled for a decade more, consolidating his dominion, strengthening the links between faith and kingship. Under his reign, Pictish art reached its zenith. The great cross slabs of Aberlemno and Magle likely date to this era. Their carvings of horsemen and intertwined beasts may well depict the victory of Dunishan itself turned into eternal pattern. In stone, as always, the Picts wrote their history without words. When Brede died in 693, the annals recorded his passing with simple reverence. Brede, son of Beli king of the Picts, died. No cause, no embellishment. But the silence says enough. He had transformed his people from a scattered confederation into a nation. He had fought an empire and won. And he had done it not with sheer numbers, but with intelligent strategy, patience, and an understanding that sometimes faith and fog are the best armor of all. In the centuries that followed, bards would remember him not as a destroyer, but as a unifier, the king who reminded the world that the Picts were no mere footnote between Romans and Scots. They were a civilization with a destiny written in both scripture and smoke. When you stand today on Dunishan Hill, the air still feels heavy with presence. The fields are quiet. The reeds whisper in the wind. And sometimes when the mist curls low over the bogs, the world seems to flicker. You could almost believe that for a heartbeat the paint gleams again. The horns sound, and a shadowed king stands watching from the high ground, his cloak snapping in the wind. Brede Mac Billy had turned myth into history, and history into myth again. The Painted Ones had become a kingdom. History loves to remember its founders and forget its finishers. Bridie MacBilly had forged the kingdom. A century later, Wengus MacFergusa, Angus son of Fergus, would turn it into an empire. His reign, beginning around 729 CE, marked the highest crest of Pictish power. For a single generation, the Painted people ruled the north with wealth, piety, and terrifying efficiency. Their kings were not ghosts in mist anymore. They were monarchs whose word rippled across seas. Oengus came from humble beginnings, or at least from the lesser royal line of Serkin, the kingdom of the Mearns. His ascent was improbable, steeped in intrigue and blood. The early 8th century was a chessboard of feuding dynasties, where cousins killed cousins in pursuit of the throne of Fortriu, the heartland of Pictish rule. Oengus, ambitious, calculating, perhaps even ruthless, played that game better than anyone. When he seized power in 729, it was through force and cunning, and it startled the nobility into submission. The annals call him Oengus Rex Pictorum, King of the Picts. But before his reign was done, his titles would stretch far beyond that. From the moment he took the throne, Oengus behaved like a man born for dominion. He reorganized the realm, placing loyal kin and allies in charge of sub-kingdoms. He built alliances with the Gaels of Dalriata, and when alliances failed, he crushed them. His armies moved not as raiders, but as administrators with swords. Wherever they marched, new fortifications rose, trade routes reopened, and tributes flowed back to his capital. He was not content to rule. He meant to unify. For centuries, the Picts had been a mosaic of clans. Oengus melted that mosaic into one glittering mirror reflecting power. He expanded the influence of the church, ensuring monks and abbots blessed his campaigns. Every victory became a holy war. Cross and crown, once uneasy bedfellows, now moved as one. But it was war, not faith, that carved his legend into the granite of history. In 736, Oengus invaded the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata, his western rival across the mountains. The Gaels had long raided Pictish lands and boasted of saints like Columba, who had tamed their northern cousins. Oengus intended to repay those boasts in kind. The battle chronicles are brief, but brutal fortresses burned, kings slain, the western coasts left desolate. Dalriata was shattered. Its ruling families fled to Ireland, its monasteries stripped of wealth. For the first time, the Picts ruled from the North Sea to the Atlantic. It was during this campaign that Oengus became something new in British politics, an imperial monarch. Not just the king of a tribe, but a ruler whose authority stretched over multiple peoples. The annals speak of him with a wary reverence, Oengus I of the Picts, to hold power over all Britain. An exaggeration, perhaps, but it captures the awe he inspired. His army even reached into the northern territories of Strathclyde and menaced the Anglian strongholds of Lothian. For a flicker in time, it seemed possible that all of Scotland might bow beneath the serpent banner of Pictland. And yet, for all his steel, Oengus was also a builder. His reign saw the flowering of the monastic renaissance that Brede had begun. He was a generous patron of Iona, which, after recovering from earlier Viking raids, became again a center of learning and artistry. He also founded Abernethy, a monastery that would later serve as both sanctuary and treasury for Pictish kings. Religion under Oengus was no longer the fragile seed planted by Columba. It had become the kingdom's spine. Bishops advised generals. Abbots tallied tribute. The written word and the sword of state worked hand in hand. The Pictish art of this age reached its pinnacle too. The great cross slabs of Meagle Duplin and St. Andrews bear his era's stamped massive stones carved with crucifixes entwined by beasts, warriors on horseback, angels above kings. These monuments are not modest expressions of faith. They are propaganda in stone. They proclaim divine sanction for royal power, blending Celtic energy with imperial grandeur. Where earlier stones had whispered of mystery, Wengus's stones roared of authority. He also turned his gaze south toward Northumbria, the same foe who had once learned humility at Dunishan. But now the relationship was different, no longer a desperate defense of freedom, but a contest of equals. Wengus made alliances through marriage and diplomacy, intertwining his dynasty with the powerful Anglo-Saxon families. For a time, the borders held in uneasy respect. The chroniclers even record the exchange of relics and priests, as if God himself were moderating the peace. And yet Oengus was not immune to the gravity of ambition. Around 740 CE he overreached. He turned on his own allies in Dalriada, fearing rebellion, and launched a campaign of purges so severe that the Irish annals simply note great slaughter among the Scots. It was the paradox of his reign unity achieved through devastation. He held the realm together by force of will, but beneath the surface cracks widened. Still, his control endured. For more than 30 years, Oengus ruled an empire that stretched farther than any Pictish king before or after. His power was felt even across the Irish Sea. In 747, the annals call him head of the Picts and ruler of all the nations north of the Forth. Trade flourished. Silver from the Norse wine from Gaul, salt from Ireland, all flowed through ports like Burghead and Aberdeen, paying for armies and monasteries alike. The Picts had become the link between the Atlantic and the North Sea, the crossroads of early medieval Britain. But as always, the higher the tower, the sharper the fall. In his later years, Oengus turned inward, retreating into piety. The chronicles grow quiet, speaking of pilgrimages and donations to churches. Perhaps the weight of conquest had grown heavy. Perhaps he saw the storm coming. For in the west, a new threat was stirring the Norsemen, their dragon ships slipping across the gray horizon. The first raids had already begun in Ireland, and soon they would touch the shores of Pictland too. Wengus would not live to see the full fury of it, but he must have sensed the tremor. He died in 761 CE, after more than 3 decades on the throne, a lifetime in an age when kings rarely lasted 5 years. The annalists usually terse sound, almost reverent. Wengus, king of the Picts, rested in peace. A small phrase for a man who had remade a nation. Under Oengus, the Picts reached their zenith, politically united, economically thriving, culturally luminous. Their art had become international, their faith mature, their rule respected even by rivals. For a generation, the painted people stood not as a curiosity on the edge of empire, but as an empire of their own. And yet even at its brightest, the light was beginning to thin. The structures Oengus built kingdom church art would endure for only another century before the sea winds carried change. The gales would rise again, the Norse would descend, and the name Pict itself would begin to fade. But for now, imagine the twilight of his reign. Wengus, standing on the ramparts of his fortress at Forteviot, the River Erne, glinting below the air, heavy with the smell of rain and heather. Around him, the land is quiet, obedient, prosperous. He has made the wild north sing in harmony, if only for a while. The cross gleams on the horizon, carved in stone and silver. The fires of the forges glow red through the mist. And the king of all the painted people, Oengus the Great, watches his realm shimmer like a reflection on still water, beautiful, perfect, and perilously thin. The first warning didn't come from an army, but from the sea itself. A strange ship, drifting out of the gray dawn, its prow carved into a dragon's snarl, its sail striped in red and cream. The monks of Iona saw it first in the year 793, long before the Picts themselves realized the storm had arrived. The chronicles would later call it a great terror upon the people of God. To the Picts, it was the beginning of the end of the age of peace Wengus had built. The Vikings, that word wasn't yet known in Pictland, came not with treaties, but with fire. They were men from across the sea, from Norway and Denmark, where fjords bit into mountains and winters drove hunger into ambition. They came for silver for slaves, for stories of paradise whispered by the winds. And when they reached the Pictish coast, they found a land that glimmered with both faith and wealth. Monasteries, after all, were easy targets, filled with gold, unguarded, and pacifist by definition. At first, the raids were quick, almost surgical. A few longships appearing off the coast of Orkney, Shetland, or Caithness. A rush of warriors in iron helmets. Torches screamed smoke. The raiders returned to their ships with chalices and relics, leaving the shore littered with ash and confusion. By the time the local warriors arrived from inland, the sea had already swallowed the invaders again. The Picts had fought the Romans and the Saxons, but this was different. They could not outmarch the ocean. The monasteries of Iona, Port Mahomac, and Deir, those quiet cradles of the new faith, became the first casualties. The monks, who had once turned pagan kings into Christians, now found themselves martyrs. The chroniclers tell of abbot and novice alike slaughtered at their altars, their illuminated manuscripts scattered and soaked in blood. The survivors fled inland, carrying relics and fragments of books, their prayers suddenly mixed with terror. The Viking ships soon returned bolder, hungrier. They came not just to raid, but to settle. By the early 9th century, they had established bases in Orkney and Shetland, then moved down the coast, carving out enclaves in the Hebrides and along the Moray Firth. What had once been Pictish harbors, filled with trade, now filled with foreign sails. And unlike Rome, which sought to civilize, the Norse sought to consume. They didn't build walls, they built harbors. They didn't impose taxes, they took tribute by axe. To the Picts, it must have felt like the sea itself had turned against them. The coastline became haunted. Smoke plumes on the horizon meant death by nightfall. The monks called it divine punishment. The kings called it war. Yet at first, the Picts resisted fiercely. Fortresses along the Moray coast were rebuilt in haste, signal fires lit on promontories. Their warriors adapted quickly, abandoning the slow discipline of field battles for the quick, savage strikes of ambush and counter-raid. They learned to use the Norse's own mobility against them, striking when the longships were beached, burning them before they could launch again. But it was a losing game. For every ship destroyed, 2 more came the next spring. The Norse had patience, and the Picts had too much to lose. Their wealth, their faith, their ports, all lay along the very edges of the sea that now betrayed them. By mid-century, the Vikings had established permanent settlements along the northern coasts, and even the Orkney Jarls began to claim dominion over lands that once paid tribute to Fortriu. Norse skalds sang of Pictland, the plundered of gold crosses and silver chains carried back to Trondheim. To them, the Picts were ghosts with treasure, a people who guarded sacred wealth, but had forgotten how to wield it. It was brutal poetry, but not entirely wrong. The Pictish kings, faced with enemies from every direction, tried to adapt. Some forged alliances with Irish princes. Others attempted diplomacy with Norse leaders, offering trade and tribute in exchange for peace. A few even invited Norse mercenaries to fight against their rivals, only to learn, as so many rulers would, that the wolf doesn't distinguish between the hand that feeds and the hand that fights. The devastation wasn't just military, it was psychological. For centuries, the Picts had believed themselves protected by both geography and God. Their mountains, their fog, their fierce independence had kept out Rome, Angles, and Gaels alike. But the sea was their lifeline. And now it was the invaders' highway. Monasteries emptied. Artisans fled inland. The beautiful, illuminated manuscripts that once adorned the halls of kings now lay hidden in caves or buried in bogs, preserved by accident rather than intention. And yet amidst this ruin, something strange happened: adaptation. The Picts began to imitate their enemies. In the ruins of coastal towns, Norse-style artifacts appear: axes, combs, jewelry, ship nails blended with native craftsmanship. In Orkney and Caithness, families of mixed blood emerged: Norse fathers and Pictish mothers, their children fluent in both languages, their gods a blend of Odin and Christ. The storm was destructive, yes, but also creative. Out of it would rise the next Scotland, though no one knew it yet. Still, for a generation, the horizon remained a wound. The royal court of Fortriu, once the radiant center of Oengis's empire, grew paranoid and fragile. Kings fell quickly: Urod, Bride, Seven, Sinead, each assassinated or overthrown in rapid succession. Civil war and Viking pressure worked hand in hand, eroding the structure of Pictish unity that had taken centuries to build. Monks wrote fewer chronicles. The great stones ceased to be carved. The artistic silence was deafening. Even nature seemed to echo the collapse. The climate cooled slightly in these years. Harvests failed more often. Famine followed raids, and raids followed famine. Entire coastal communities vanished from the record, their names replaced by Norse ones: Wick, Thurso, Lerwick. The land that had once whispered in Pictish syllables now spoke a different tongue. And yet, even as history's tide pulled them under, the Picts did not vanish overnight. In the heartland of Fortriu inland, and shielded by hills they fought on, a few monasteries survived, turning their isolation into sanctity. The old fortresses were manned again, not by kings, but by warlords who claimed descent from Oengis and Bride. They watched the coast burn and prayed that time, their oldest ally, might yet turn in their favor. But time was changing too. To the west, the Gaels of Dalriada, once crushed by Oengis, had rebuilt under new leadership. Their kingdom of Alba Gaelic for Scotland was growing stronger. Their kings spoke Latin, wielded both the sword and the psalter, and were beginning to call themselves heirs to the whole North. And somewhere, in that mingling of Gael Norse and Pict, a new identity was forming quietly, inexorably. For the moment, though, the Picts stood battered and bloodied. Their churches burned, their coastlines foreign. They had survived. Rome defied Saxons and outlasted time itself. But the Northmen were a new breed of storm, one that didn't conquer, but consumed. If you stand today on a northern beach in Scotland, where the dunes meet the wind, you can still see the ghosts of that first terror. The sea looks peaceful, but the names on the maps, Unst, Yelhaxa, Orkney, still speak Norse. The bones of monks still rest beneath those sands, clutching iron bells that once called for prayer. And far inland, where no Viking oar ever reached the stones of Pictland, still stand silent witnesses to a people who faced every invasion with the same stubborn creed: we do not vanish. We endure. Empires rarely die in a single night. They fade like twilight, one color at a time. By the middle of the 9th century, the once golden age of the Picts had dimmed into a long dusk. Their kings still wore silver chains and called themselves rulers of Fortriu, but their dominion was unraveling thread by thread beneath the weight of raids, rivalries, and the slow, inexorable tide of change. For 2 centuries, they had stood as the masters of the North. Now, the same geography that once protected them, those mountains and sea locks, those twisting glens, turned to isolation. The Norse pressed from the coasts, the Gaels advanced from the west, and the Angles looked northward from the borders. The Picts, who had outlasted Rome and defied empire, found themselves encircled by smaller powers that moved faster, adapted quicker, and spoke to one another in languages the Picts had never learned to use: trade, diplomacy, and inheritance. Their kings came and went like seasons. The chronicles list them in terse succession: Urod, 839, Bride, Sinead, Drest, Talorc, each reigning a handful of years, each killed, overthrown, or forgotten. The annalists, once proud to describe victories and alliances, now recorded little more than obituaries. The rhythm of governance had been replaced by the rhythm of survival. Even the monks' pens grew weary. The Vikings continued their relentless work, burning the coastlines, taking slaves and treasure, but by now the raids had become routine, almost predictable. It was the internal fractures that hurt most. Pictish nobility, once united under Oengus the Great, had splintered into rival houses, each clinging to its patch of soil and ancestry. When a Viking fleet attacked, the north-southern Picts did not always send aid. When Gaelic raiders struck from Dal Riata, the northern chieftains shrugged, "Not my kin, not my fight." A civilization dies not when it is conquered, but when it forgets how to recognize itself. The year 839 CE is often cited as the fatal blow. That summer, a massive Viking army struck deep into the heart of Fortriu, catching the Pictish forces and their allied Scots of Dal Riata in open battle. The annals record it with grim precision. The Picts were slain in great numbers, together with Eogan's son of Oengus, king of the Picts, and Aed, king of Dal Riata. Both monarchies shattered on the same field. The site of that battle is lost somewhere, perhaps in the valleys of Strathspey, but the echo of it reverberated for generations. 2 royal lines fell in a single day, leaving the north, headless, directionless, ripe for absorption. In the wake of that catastrophe, power flowed not to another Pictish dynasty, but to the Gaels, whose small western kingdom had quietly rebuilt itself while the north bled. The sons of Dal Riata, whose ancestors Oengus had once crushed, now found themselves the inheritors of his ruins. Their leader was Kenneth MacAlpin, a man of mixed lineage, part Gaelic, part Pictish, who understood both worlds. In him, history saw its pivot. But before Kenneth's name would echo through chronicles, there were years of anarchy. The heartland of Fortriu was burned. Hillforts long thought impregnable lay silent, their timber walls blackened. Monasteries vanished entirely from record. No more manuscripts, no more cross slabs, no more miracle tales. The art of carving itself seemed to die with the kings. The land that had once been covered in symbols grew mute. Yet even amid the ruins, traces of life persisted. Inland, away from the Viking tides, villages endured. Farmers still plowed, children still learned prayers in broken Latin. Old women whispered blessings over newborns that sounded suspiciously like pagan charms. The faith remained, but it had turned inward, private, no longer sculpted in stone. The Picts had once been the world's most visible, invisible people, painted, carved, symbol rich. Now they became invisible in truth, hiding in their own land. Archaeology shows this transformation like a dimming heartbeat. After the 830s, the great monumental stones cease abruptly. The intricate knotwork of cross slabs gives way to rough, unadorned markers. The craft of metalworking declines. Imported goods vanish from the record. Even the burial customs change. Graves become simpler, more Gaelic in style. The Pictish aesthetic, so confident in its geometry and balance, dissolves into a new language of form, the early medieval Scotland of wood and script of crosses and crowns. And yet, it would be wrong to call this the extinction of the Picts. People do not vanish. Only the words used to describe them do. The farmers who lived in Angus and Fife and Moray still spoke their dialects, still tilled the same soil, still carried the same blood in their veins. What disappeared was not the people, it was the brand, the political identity of Pict. The name faded from chronicles because the Gaels wrote the chronicles, and to the Gaels, everyone north of the Forth was now Albanac Scot. Assimilation disguised as resurrection. Still, the shadow of the Old Kingdom lingered in stories. Monks in later centuries wrote of painted men who vanished into the hills of fortresses, turned to smoke, of kings betrayed by kin. Folklore filled the gaps history had left blank. In some glens, people whispered that the Picts had not died, but retreated underground into the earth itself, where they still hammered silver and carved runes by lamplight. Shepherds told tales of finding their doors in the hillside, of faint singing beneath the turf. The Picts, it seemed, refused to stop being mysterious even in myth. Perhaps that was their final victory. Civilizations that depend on conquest leave ruins. Those that depend on memory leave riddles. The Picts were never conquered completely. They were translated. Their art became Christian decoration. Their kingship became Scottish monarchy. Their language dissolved into Gaelic. But their symbols, the serpent's crescents, double discs, still whisper in church carvings, in heraldry, even in the folds of Celtic design that tourists buy on keychains today. The line continues invisible, but unbroken. By the late 9th century, the chronicles no longer mention Fortriu or the Picts. They speak instead of a new kingdom, Alba ruled by Kenneth MacAlpin, said by later legend to have united the Scots and Picts through both diplomacy and a touch of treachery. His story, the so-called MacAlpin's treason, would become one of Scotland's great origin myths, a tale of banquet and betrayal, where the last Pictish nobles were slain at a feast, their thrones absorbed into a single Scottish crown. But that, of course, belongs to the next chapter. For now, picture the land at the moment of transformation. The fortresses silent, the sea still restless, the last symbol stones half buried in moss. Smoke drifts from the ruins of a monastery, its charred cross gleaming faintly in the rain. A shepherd passes by, whispers a prayer he learned from his grandmother, a prayer older than both Rome and Christ. Somewhere beneath his feet, the past sleeps lightly. The Picts had not disappeared. They had simply stepped behind the curtain of history into the half-light, where myth and memory share a single breath. The mist had closed again around them, but this time the mist would never part. Every age ends with a story to explain it. For the Picts, that story was whispered in cloisters and sung by Gaelic bards, the tale of Kenneth MacAlpin, the man who united two peoples, and if you believe, the legends destroyed one of them to do it. By the mid-9th century, the stage was set for such a transformation. The Pictish kingship lay in ruins after the Viking invasion of 839 CE, its dynasties shattered, and its heartland of Fortriu, a graveyard of burned forts. To the west, however, the small Gaelic realm of Dalriata, long subdued by the Picts, had survived in exile on the fringes. Its kings still ruled from the glens of Argyll, still traced their blood to the Irish royal line of the Senil and Gabrian, and still called their land by a name the Romans had never used, Alba. From this twilight rose Kenneth Syned MacAlpin, a man whose bloodline was both Gaelic and Pictish. His father, Alpin, may have been a minor Gaelic prince. His mother, according to some sources, a Pictish noblewoman from royal stock. In a world where lineage was legitimacy, that dual heritage made Kenneth uniquely qualified to claim both crowns. But it was the chaos after the great defeat of 839 CE that gave him opportunity. When Viking fleets devastated Fortriu and slew both the Pictish king and the Scottish one, Kenneth stepped into the vacuum, not merely as a survivor, but as an architect. The chronicles are silent on how exactly he took power, which is why the storytellers filled in the gaps with poetry and poison. According to later medieval legend, Kenneth invited the remaining Pictish nobles to a grand feast of reconciliation somewhere in Scone or Fortivio. The tables were set, the mead poured, the alliances sealed, or so it seemed. But beneath each seat, the Gaels had laid concealed pits lined with blades. At the signal, the floor gave way. The Pictish lords fell to their deaths, and the feast became a massacre. The tale is known as MacAlpin's treason, and though historians doubt its literal truth, its symbolism is perfect. The banquet where one nation was swallowed by another. In reality, Kenneth's conquest was likely slower, subtler. He married politics to inevitability. Many Pictish nobles, weary of chaos and Norse raids, accepted his protection willingly. Others were absorbed through marriage or inheritance. His strength lay not in overwhelming armies, but in inheritance law under the Picts' own matrilineal custom. A man with royal blood through his mother could claim the throne. Kenneth may simply have used their system to replace them. The irony is exquisite Pictish law paved the way for their own succession's undoing. By around 843 CE, Kenneth had been crowned as Re-Alban King of Alba, the new fused realm that united the Gaelic West and the Pictish North under one crown. It was not yet Scotland, not yet the land of clans and castles, but it was something no one had achieved before, a single kingdom stretching from the Firth of Clyde to the Moray Firth. In that moment, the long age of the Picts ended not with extinction, but with transformation. In Kenneth's court, you could hear three languages: Latin in the mouths of monks, Gaelic in the songs of bards, and faint traces of Pictish in the speech of old men who still remembered the serpent stones. Over the next generations, the Pictish tongue would fade first from law, then from liturgy, and finally from memory. Its sounds may still survive in the landscape, in river names, like Dee and Don in Pitt. Prefixes, marking old territories, in the ghosts of syllables that cling to Scottish geography like ancient fingerprints. The people themselves remained farming, trading, marrying into the new Gaelic nobility. The transformation was so complete that even they forgot it had happened. Kenneth's Alba was not a serene kingdom. It was a work in progress. The Vikings still raided the coasts, forcing him to move sacred relics, including the bones of Saint Columba, from Iona to the safety of Dunkeld. There, the old Irish saint's remains became the palladium of the new kingdom, a relic linking Gaelic Christianity and Pictish faith into one symbol. Dunkeld perched among forests, and river mist became the spiritual heart of Alba. The capital shifted between Scone Forteviot and Dunkeld, depending on whether the king needed soldiers, scribes, or saints. Kenneth proved as pragmatic as he was ruthless. He restructured land ownership, blending Gaelic clan loyalties with remnants of Pictish administration. He built alliances with remaining Pictish families by granting them church lands and monasteries. His scribes began the long process of rewriting history itself. The annals that once spoke of the men of Fortriu now spoke of the men of Alba. Identity, that fragile human invention, was being edited in real time. And yet the memory of Pictland did not vanish entirely. In the art of Kenneth's era, one can still see the old patterns, the serpents, the crescents, the double discs recast as Christian symbols. The cross slabs of Magel and St. Andrews still bore beasts that belonged as much to pre-Christian myth as to gospel allegory. The visual grammar of the Picts became the aesthetic language of the Scots. A civilization had died, but its art became the architecture of a new one. Kenneth reigned for roughly 16 years, a long time in that brutal century. He died in 858 CE, possibly at Fortiviot, leaving behind sons who would rule in his image. Later Scottish chroniclers called him the first king of the Scots, but that is an oversimplification. He was the last king of the Picts too. In him, the two nations fused, one giving the name the other the spine. The century after his death saw the new kingdom tested by Norse invasions, dynastic feuds, and cultural assimilation. Gaelic eventually became the royal language. The church reorganized along Irish lines, spread its script and law across the north. Yet beneath it all, the foundations remained Pictish. The old fortresses, the carved stones marking boundaries, the matrilineal respect for alliance and kinship that lingered even as surnames began to replace tribal titles. The DNA of the painted people remained quietly written into the new nation's code. If you walk through the churchyard at Scone, where the kings of Alba would later be crowned upon the Stone of Destiny, you walk over layers of history compacted into one patch of soil. Beneath the medieval abbey lies an older sanctuary, and beneath that, a pagan mound where Pictish kings once stood barefoot to pledge themselves to the goddess of the land. The ritual changed. The meaning did not. The throne of Scotland stands quite literally on Pictish ground. In this way, the story of the Picts ends not as a tragedy, but as a metamorphosis. They vanished by becoming everything. Their language died, but their art survived. Their name faded, but their blood filled the veins of a new people. They ceased to be the painted ones and became instead the brushstrokes in the portrait of Scotland. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy for a civilization born from mist to dissolve into it, once more leaving beauty behind. The stones still stand, the patterns still curl, and the land they once ruled still carries their rhythm in its rivers and hills. The Romans built walls to keep them out. The Picts built memory to keep themselves alive. And long after every wall has crumbled, their memory remains.